66 million years ago, the world woke up for the last time, not the planet. The planet would survive, but the world, the one that had existed for over 160 million years, the world of giants, of teeth and claws and thundering footsteps, that world was counting down its final hours, and not a single creature walking beneath that ancient sun had any idea. Picture the dawn of that morning, the sky painted in shades of amber and rose, clouds drifting lazy and fat over a landscape so green it would hurt your eyes. This was not some barren wasteland. This was paradise, a planet so thick with life that every square metre hummed, with something breathing, something hunting, something being born. So yeah, subscribe if you're here a lot. Drop your city and time in the comments. Someone from Bristol said they listen while making breakfast. Someone from Buffalo said before bed. Food for thought, literally. The air smelled different back then. Heavier, warmer, the oxygen levels were higher, the atmosphere denser, and because of that, everything could grow bigger, stronger, more terrifying than anything that walks the earth today. Dragonflies with wingspans the length of your arm. Crocodiles that made modern ones look like house pets. And the dinosaurs. Oh, the dinosaurs. They had been here so long that they had become the planet itself. Think about that for a moment. Humans have existed for maybe 300,000 years. We have had civilization, agriculture, cities for roughly 10,000. The dinosaurs ruled for 165 million years. They were not visitors on this earth. They were the landlords, the architects, the kings of a kingdom so vast and so ancient that our entire human story could fit into a single afternoon of theirs. And on this particular morning, in what we now call the late Cretaceous, they were everywhere. In the swamps of what would become Louisiana, a herd of duck-billed hadrosaurs waded through chest-deep water, their calls echoing across miles of wetland. These were not small animals. They stood 3 stories tall, weighed as much as elephants, and moved in herds of hundreds. Their crests, those strange hollow tubes on their skulls, worked like trumpets, blasting sounds that could travel for miles through the humid air. They were talking to each other, warning each other, calling to their young. Further north, where the Rocky Mountains were just beginning to push up from the earth, packs of dromaeosaurs darted through the underbrush. These were the raptors you think you know from movies, but smaller, meaner, covered in feathers that rippled in the wind like the plumage of murderous birds. They hunted in coordinated groups, communicating with chirps and hisses, their sickle claws clicking against stone as they tracked their prey. And in the open plains that stretched from horizon to horizon, the giants grazed, triceratops, thousands of them, their 3-horned faces lowered to the ferns, their beaked mouths stripping vegetation with mechanical efficiency. Each one weighed as much as a school bus. Their frill, that massive shield of bone behind their skulls, was not just for show. It was armor, protection against the one creature that every animal on this continent feared. The Tyrannosaurus rex was awake. Somewhere in the pre-dawn darkness, in a forest of towering conifers that had stood for millions of years, one of them stirred, not the largest of its kind, but large enough, 40 feet from nose to tail, 12,000 pounds of muscle, bone, and hunger. Its eyes, set forward like a predator, scanned the shadows with a precision that modern science tells us was extraordinary. The T-Rex could see better than a hawk, could smell blood from miles away, could feel vibrations in the ground through specialized sensors in its feet. It did not know this would be its last hunt. The morning progressed as it always had, as it had for millions of mornings before. The sun climbed higher, the temperature rose. In the shallow seas that covered much of what is now the American Midwest, mosasaurs cruised through the warm water, their serpentine bodies cutting through schools of fish with lazy efficiency. These were not dinosaurs, they were marine reptiles, cousins of modern lizards, but grown to sizes that defied imagination, 40 feet long. Jaws lined with teeth like railroad spikes. They had replaced the earlier marine giants, the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, and now they owned the oceans. Above them, pteranodons glided on wings of skin stretched over fingers that had evolved into living aircraft. They rode the thermal columns rising from the warm water, barely flapping, conserving energy as they scanned the surface for fish. Some of them had wingspans of 30 feet. They were the largest creatures ever to fly, and they flew with an elegance that modern birds cannot match. This was the world at its peak. Scientists who study this era describe it as an explosion of diversity. The flowering plants, which had first appeared earlier in the Cretaceous, were now everywhere, transforming the planet in ways that would make everything that came after possible. Bees had evolved to pollinate them. Butterflies danced between blossoms that looked remarkably like the ones in your garden today. The entire machinery of modern ecosystems, the relationships between plants and insects and birds, all of it was being assembled right here, right now, in this lost world. But there was something else happening too, something invisible, deep beneath the surface, in the rock layers that would one day tell us this story. The planet was changing. Massive volcanic eruptions in what is now India, in a region called the Deccan Traps, had been pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere for nearly 1 million years. The climate was already stressed. Sea levels were fluctuating. Some dinosaur species were already in decline. The world was wounded, and the wound was about to become fatal, because far away in the cold darkness between Mars and Jupiter, something had been travelling for longer than any dinosaur had been alive. A rock, just a rock, but a rock the size of a mountain. It had been born in the violence of the early solar system, when planets were still forming, when collisions were common, when destruction was just another word for creation. For 4 billion years, it had orbited the Sun in the asteroid belt, one of millions of similar chunks of ancient debris, unremarkable, unnoticed, patient. And then, at some point in the past, something changed its path. Maybe another asteroid bumped it. Maybe a gravitational tug from Jupiter or Mars nudged it into a new trajectory. We do not know exactly when it happened, but we know it happened, because sometime around 66 million years ago, this mountain of rock crossed an invisible line. It entered a new orbit. An orbit that would eventually intersect with a small blue planet third from the Sun. The asteroid was coming. It was not fast by cosmic standards, just 20 kilometers per second, a leisurely stroll through the solar system, but it was persistent, unstoppable, and it was pointed directly at a shallow sea on the northern coast of a peninsula that would one day be called Yucatan. None of the creatures living their last day on Earth could see it. Even if they had looked up, it was still too far away, too small against the infinite black. But it was there, falling, accelerating, closing the distance that remained between itself and everything they had ever known. Back on the ground, the day continued. A mother Maiasaura tended her nest in the Montana highlands, arranging vegetation around her eggs to keep them warm. These dinosaurs were unusual. They cared for their young in ways that scientists once thought impossible for reptiles. They built communal nesting grounds, returned to the same sites year after year, fed their babies until they were strong enough to follow the herd. She had done this before. She would not do it again. In the forests of what would become New Jersey, a small mammal no bigger than a rat scurried through the leaf litter, searching for insects. It was furry, warm-blooded, nocturnal. It had been living in the shadows of the dinosaurs for over 100 million years, never growing larger than a house cat, always hiding, always waiting. It did not know that its time was almost here. And in the warm waters of the western interior seaway, a juvenile Tylosaurus chased a school of fish through the shallows. It was only 15 feet long, still growing, still learning to hunt. It would never reach adulthood. The hours passed. The sun began its long arc toward the western horizon, painting the sky in colours that had not changed in millions of years. Shadows lengthened across the forests. The air cooled slightly. Predators began to stir again, sensing that the hunting would soon begin. Prey animals grew more alert, their ancient instincts warning them that darkness brought danger, but they were watching for the wrong danger. High above them, invisible in the afternoon glare, the asteroid had entered the neighborhood. It had passed the orbit of the moon. It was falling faster now, gravity pulling it in, accelerating it toward a destiny written 66 million years before any of them were born. The last sunset of the old world began, and no one noticed the sky beginning to change. In the final hours, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the planet continued its eternal routines. Rivers flowed to the sea, waves crashed on ancient beaches, trees swayed in winds that carried the scent of flowers and rot and life in all its messy glory. Somewhere a dinosaur took its last breath without knowing it was the last. Somewhere else, an egg that would never hatch sat in a nest that would be buried and forgotten for 66 million years. The asteroid was close now. Close enough that if any creature had looked up at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place, they might have seen a new star in the sky, brighter than the others, moving, but they did not look up. Why would they? The sky had always been safe. The sky was where birds flew and clouds drifted and nothing fell except rain. They could not have imagined what was coming. The atmosphere began to feel the pressure of that approaching mass, the air ahead of it starting to compress, starting to heat. In the final minutes, the leading edge would become hotter than the surface of the sun. The rock would glow white, then blue, trailing a tail of plasma and fire across the heavens. But those minutes had not arrived yet. For now, there was only the twilight, the peaceful, ordinary twilight of a planet that did not know it was about to become something else entirely. The dinosaurs settled into their nightly routines. Some slept standing up like horses, others found sheltered spots among the rocks and trees. The nocturnal hunters opened their eyes, stretched their limbs, prepared for the dark hours ahead. Life went on. It had gone on for so long, through ice ages and volcanic winters, through the rise and fall of species too numerous to count, through 100 million years of evolution that had produced the most magnificent creatures the Earth would ever see. Life had survived everything the planet could throw at it, but this was not coming from the planet. This was coming from the stars, and in less than 12 hours the world would end. Not with a whisper, not with a gradual decline, with fire. The asteroid crossed the final 1,000,000 miles in less than a day, the final 100,000 in hours, the final 10,000 in minutes, and in those last minutes, as it punched through the atmosphere at a speed no human technology has ever matched, everything changed. But that is a story for what comes next. Because right now, in these final peaceful hours, the dinosaurs still ruled the earth, the pterosaurs still owned the skies, the mosasaurs still dominated the seas. The world was complete, perfect in its ancient violence, beautiful in its savage harmony. And somewhere in a nest in Montana, a baby dinosaur chirped for food, not knowing that by tomorrow there would be no tomorrow. The clock was ticking. The countdown had begun. and the last day of the dinosaurs was about to become the longest night the Earth had ever known. But before that night fell, there was still a world to witness, a world so alive, so crowded with wonder, that every corner held something extraordinary. Consider the forests. Not the thin, scattered woodlands we know today. These were cathedrals of green, massive conifers that had stood for centuries, their trunks wider than houses, their canopies so thick that the forest floor existed in permanent twilight. Ferns grew waist-high between the roots. Cycads spread their fronds like frozen explosions of vegetation. And everywhere, climbing up the bark, spreading across the ground, flowering plants were conquering territory that had belonged to older species for millions of years. The flowers were recent arrivals. A mere 60 million years earlier, they had not existed, but now they were everywhere, and they had changed everything. They had formed partnerships with insects that transformed how life reproduced. They had created fruits that gave animals new reasons to spread their seeds. They had painted the world in colours it had never worn before. In those forests, life layered upon life. At the very top, in the canopy where the sun still reached, primitive birds competed with flying reptiles for territory. The birds were winning. They were smaller, more agile, better adapted to the tight spaces between branches. They had already begun to push the pterosaurs out of the forests and into the open skies where their size was an advantage instead of a liability. Lower down, in the middle layers, small dinosaurs that were not quite birds hunted for insects and small mammals. These were the theropods that evolution was still experimenting with. Some had feathers for warmth, others had feathers for display, a few had feathers that were just beginning to function as wings. And on the forest floor, in the shadows where sunlight rarely reached, the scavengers and decomposers did their eternal work. Beetles the size of your fist crawled through the rotting vegetation. Millipedes that stretched for several feet wound their way through the decay. Everything that died became food for something else. Nothing was wasted. This was the machinery of a living planet working at peak efficiency. The swamps held their own wonders. In the lowlands, where rivers spread into vast wetlands, a different community thrived. Here the water was warm, rich with nutrients washed down from the highlands, thick with the algae that formed the base of countless food chains. Crocodilians lurked in the shallows, some of them barely changed from their ancestors millions of years before, already perfect, already adapted, already waiting for a future they would survive to see. Among them moved the hadrosaurs, those duck-billed giants that seemed designed for exactly this environment. Their feet were partially webbed, their teeth were arranged in batteries of hundreds, perfect for grinding the tough vegetation that grew in the wetlands. They spent their days wading through the marshes, eating constantly, growing to sizes that seem impossible for any land animal. A single adult hadrosaur consumed hundreds of pounds of vegetation every day. A herd of thousands stripped entire valleys bare, then moved on, giving the land time to recover before they returned. They were living lawn mowers, ecosystem engineers, creatures so numerous that their footsteps shaped the very landscape they walked upon, and they were not alone in those swamps. Smaller dinosaurs darted between their legs, snatching insects disturbed by the giant's passage. Turtles that looked almost identical to modern ones floated in the still waters, as patient then as they are today. Salamanders and frogs filled the night with sounds that would have been familiar to any modern ear. The swamps sang with life. But step away from the wetlands, climb into the highlands, and the world changed again. The mountains that were rising along the western edge of the continent created rain shadows that produced savannas and open woodlands. Here the great herds gathered, triceratops in numbers that blackened the plains, ankylosaurs moving in armoured columns, their clubtails swinging with every step. smaller herbivores darting between the legs of the giants, eating the grasses and low shrubs that grew in the drier soil. This was predator country. The open ground favoured the hunters. There were no trees to hide behind, no swamps to slow pursuit. Here, speed and power decided who lived and who died, and at the top of that brutal hierarchy stood the Tyrannosaurus. Imagine watching one walk. Each footstep shook the ground. Each breath was a rumble you could feel in your chest. The head, massive and heavy with muscle, swung side to side as it scanned for prey. The tiny arms, useless for grasping, tucked close to the chest, vestigial reminders of ancestors who had used them for something long forgotten. This was a creature reduced to pure function, a mouth on legs, a killing machine that had been refined by 68 million years of evolution into something close to perfect. They did not hunt in packs. They did not need to. A single adult Tyrannosaurus could bring down anything that walked. Their bite force, the strongest of any land animal ever measured, could crush bone like breadsticks. Their teeth, serrated like steak knives, sawed through flesh with brutal efficiency. They did not eat their prey. They dismembered it, and yet they were also parents. Recent discoveries have shown us something remarkable about these monsters. They cared for their young, they built nests, they brought food to their babies until they were large enough to hunt on their own. Beneath that terrifying exterior beat something that we might recognize as devotion. On this last day, somewhere on those plains, a Tyrannosaurus was teaching its offspring to hunt. The juvenile, already the size of a horse, was learning to track prey by scent. The parent, patient in ways we do not associate with predators, guided it toward a wounded Edmontosaurus that had been separated from its herd. This lesson would never be completed. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, as the world began its transition from the heat of day to the cool of evening, the ordinary business of survival continued everywhere. Nest building, feeding, mating, fighting, dying, living. The earth turned beneath a sky that had not changed in millions of years. But that sky was about to betray them all. Because falling toward them, moving faster than anything had ever moved through their world, was an object that did not belong to Earth at all. It had come from the cold places between planets, from the empty dark where nothing lived, where nothing could live. It was a messenger from the void, and its message was extinction. In the last hours of daylight, some animals began to behave strangely. We cannot know this for certain, but science gives us reasons to suspect. Animals are sensitive to changes in magnetic fields, to subtle vibrations in the ground, to shifts in air pressure that precede storms, and what was coming was the greatest storm the planet had ever faced. Perhaps some of them sensed it. Perhaps some grew restless, agitated, looking toward the horizon as if waiting for something that had no name. But even if they felt it, they could not have understood it. The asteroid was now just hours away. It had already passed Mars. It had already crossed the vast distance between the red planet and Earth. It was falling now, accelerating under gravity, heading toward a collision that would mark the end of an era and the beginning of ours. The sun touched the western horizon. The sky blazed orange and red, colours that had painted a trillion sunsets before this one. Birds settled into their roosts, pterosaurs folded their wings, the great herds slowed their grazing and began to cluster together for the protection that numbers provided. Predators opened their eyes and began to move. Night was coming, but so was something else. Something that would burn brighter than any dawn, something that would fall from the heavens like the anger of gods, something that would end the reign of creatures who had ruled this planet since before there were flowers, before there were grasses, before there was anything that we would recognize as our world. The dinosaurs did not know this was their last night. They could not know. They simply lived as they had always lived, following instincts written in their genes by millions of years of evolution. They hunted, they slept, they guarded their young, they did all the things that living creatures do when they do not know that death is coming. And high above them, growing brighter by the hour, the asteroid continued its fall. The stars came out, one by one, in a sky that would never look quite the same again. The night passed like every night before it. Quiet in some places, violent in others, the darkness brought out the hunters who preferred to kill when their prey could not see them coming. In the forests, small predatory dinosaurs with enormous eyes tracked mammals through the undergrowth, their pupils dilated wide to catch every scrap of starlight. In the open plains, packs of smaller tyrannosaurs, species we have only recently discovered, worked together to bring down prey too large for any single hunter. Death was everywhere that night, but death was normal. Death was how the world worked. The hours crawled past. In the eastern sky, the first hints of grey began to appear. The stars faded one by one, surrendering to a dawn that would be unlike any other. Animals that had slept through the darkness began to stir. Eyes opened, lungs filled. Hearts that had slowed during the cool hours began to quicken with the promise of warmth. Nobody saw the new light in the sky. It appeared in the south just above the horizon, a point of brightness that had not been there the night before. If any creature had noticed it, they would have seen it growing, slowly at first, then faster, a spark becoming a flame becoming a fire becoming something that had no name in any language that would ever exist. The asteroid had entered its final approach. It was moving at 72,000 kilometers per hour now, faster than any bullet, faster than any rocket humans would build for millions of years. At that speed, the air itself became an enemy. The atmosphere, that thin shell of gas that made life possible, began to push back against the intruder. Compression waves formed at the leading edge. When you compress air, it heats up. This is simple physics, something you can feel when you pump a bicycle tire, but this compression was beyond anything simple. The air ahead of the asteroid was being squeezed so violently, so suddenly, that its temperature rose to tens of thousands of degrees. Hotter than the surface of the sun. Hot enough to vaporize steel. Hot enough to turn rock into plasma. The asteroid began to glow. First red, like heated iron, then orange, then yellow, then white, then blue, a colour so intense it would have blinded any eye that looked directly at it. The rock was burning, but not like wood burns or paper burns. It was converting its own substance into energy, shedding its outer layers in a tail of superheated gas that stretched for hundreds of kilometres behind it. And still it fell. 10 kilometres wide. That is how big it was. Not large by cosmic standards. An unremarkable chunk of debris in a solar system full of much larger objects. But size is relative compared to the thin skin of atmosphere it was about to violate, compared to the fragile ecosystems waiting below. It was a monster. The first witnesses were probably the pterosaurs. They roosted on cliffs and high places, positions that gave them the vantage to launch themselves into the morning thermals. Some of them may have been awake, preparing for the day's flight. When the southern sky began to change, they would have seen a brightness that did not belong there, a light that moved, that grew, that seemed to be falling toward them. But pterosaurs did not have the brains to understand what they were seeing. They watched, perhaps with something like curiosity, as the sky began to tear itself apart. The sound had not reached them yet. Light travels faster than sound, so for a few precious seconds the apocalypse was silent. Just a growing brilliance in the sky, a light that cast shadows pointing north, a second sun rising in the wrong place at the wrong time. Then the sound arrived. It began as a rumble. Something felt more than heard, a vibration in the bones and the earth and the air itself. Animals across the continent lifted their heads. Birds stopped singing. The great herds of the plains, the triceratops and hadrosaurs and ankylosaurs, grew still and alert, their ancient instincts screaming that something was wrong but offering no guidance on what to do about it. The rumble became a roar. The roar became a scream. The asteroid punched through the upper atmosphere in seconds, leaving behind a tunnel of superheated air that would take hours to cool. It crossed the final 100 kilometers in less than 2 heartbeats. Below it, the shallow sea that covered the Yucatan platform sparkled blue and innocent in the morning light, filled with fish and ammonites and creatures that had no idea they were about to become ghosts. The impact happened at 7:12 in the morning, local time. We know this because of the angle of the crater, the position of certain minerals that only form in specific conditions, the painstaking work of scientists who have spent decades reading the story written in stone. 7:12 in the morning. The world had been awake for less than 2 hours when everything ended. The asteroid struck the water first. But water meant nothing to something moving at that speed. The sea might as well have been empty air. The rock blasted through it in a fraction of a second, vaporizing millions of tons of seawater instantly, converting it to steam so hot it was indistinguishable from fire. The steam exploded outward at supersonic speeds, carrying with it the shredded remains of everything that had lived in those waters. Then the asteroid hit the seafloor. And the seafloor was not empty rock. It was limestone, ancient coral reefs that had been building for millions of years, mixed with deposits of gypsum and sulfur from even older seas. This would matter later. This specific geology, this particular chemistry, would turn a catastrophe into an extinction. But in the first seconds, it was just rock meeting rock at impossible speeds. The energy released was beyond human comprehension. 100 million megatons. That is the number scientists have calculated. It means nothing to us. Our minds cannot grasp such figures. So think of it this way. The largest nuclear weapon ever detonated, the Soviet Tsar bomber, released 50 megatons. The Chicxulub impact released the energy of 2 billion Tsar bombas. Every nuclear weapon ever built by humanity, detonated simultaneously, would not equal a fraction of what happened in that single second. The earth rang like a bell. The impact sent shock waves through the planet itself, seismic waves that circled the globe multiple times, triggering earthquakes on every continent, awakening volcanoes that had slept for millennia. The ground shook everywhere, in what would become Europe, in what would become Asia, in what would become Australia. The earth moved beneath the feet of creatures who had no idea why, but the shock waves through rock were only the beginning. Above ground, a wall of superheated air expanded outward from the impact site at thousands of kilometers per hour. This was not wind. Wind is gentle compared to this. This was a physical force, a moving wall of pressure and heat that flattened everything in its path. Trees that had stood for centuries were snapped like twigs. Animals were not just killed, they were erased, their bodies torn apart at the molecular level by forces that exceeded anything biology could withstand. Within the first minute, everything within 1,000 kilometers was dead. Within the first hour, the circle of total destruction had expanded to cover most of what is now Mexico and the southern United States. The forests of Texas were burning, the swamps of Louisiana were boiling, the great herds of Montana, 2,000 kilometers away, were being knocked off their feet by ground shaking so violent that standing was impossible, and then came the debris. The impact had punched a hole in the earth 20 kilometers deep. It had excavated billions of tons of rock, water, and air, hurling them upward with such force that they escaped the planet's gravity entirely. For a few minutes, the Chicxulub crater had its own atmosphere, a column of superheated gas and molten rock that rose higher than the stratosphere, higher than any mountain, higher than anything had ever risen from the surface of the Earth. This column began to collapse. The heavier debris fell first, raining down on the areas closest to the impact. Chunks of molten rock the size of cars, the size of houses, the size of buildings, fell from the sky like the anger of gods. They struck the ground, still glowing, still hot enough to ignite anything they touched. Within hours, fires were burning across 3 continents, but the smaller debris rose higher and spread farther. Billions of tons of dust and ash were injected into the upper atmosphere, where winds caught them and began to carry them around the world. This dust was not ordinary dust. It was vaporized rock, tiny spheres of glass formed when molten droplets cooled in the upper atmosphere, mixed with soot from the burning forests and sulfur from the vaporized gypsum beds of Yucatan. The sky was filling with poison. On the ground, the survivors of the initial blast were beginning to understand that survival might not be possible. The Tyrannosaurus that had been hunting in Montana when the impact occurred was still alive, but it was blind. The flash of light from the impact, visible even at that distance, had burned its retinas. It stumbled through a landscape that no longer made sense, bellowing in confusion and pain. Others had been deafened by the sound. The pressure wave, travelling at the speed of sound, had reached them minutes after the light, a wall of noise so intense that eardrums ruptured and inner ears were destroyed. They could not hear the approaching fires. They could not hear the screams of their herd mates. They wandered in silence through a world that had become hell. The tsunami came next. When the asteroid struck the shallow sea, it displaced water on a scale that defies imagination. A wave formed, not like the waves you see at the beach, but a moving mountain of water that rose more than a kilometre high near the impact site. This wave began to spread outward in all directions, carrying with it the shattered remains of everything that had lived in those waters. It crossed the Gulf of Mexico in hours. By the time it reached the coastlines of what would become Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, it was still hundreds of meters tall. It swept inland for dozens of kilometers, carrying salt water and debris and death into river valleys and lowlands that had never seen the sea. Everything in its path drowned. Everything. On the other side of the impact, the wave crossed the Proto-Caribbean and struck the coastlines of South America with similar fury. It rounded the Yucatan Peninsula and roared into the Proto-Atlantic, spreading north and south along coastlines that would not exist for millions of years. Every beach, every coastal plain, every river delta on the planet felt the impact of that wave. And still the debris fell from the sky. By midday, the ejecta had circled the globe. Tiny spheres of molten rock, cooled to glass during their journey through space, began to rain down everywhere. In Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in Australia, in Antarctica, the sky was falling. Each tiny sphere carried heat from its formation, and when billions of them fell simultaneously, they heated the atmosphere itself. The air began to cook. Scientists call this the broiler effect. The falling debris transferred so much heat to the upper atmosphere that surface temperatures rose dramatically, perhaps by hundreds of degrees in some areas. Animals that had survived the initial blast, that had escaped the tsunamis, that had avoided the fires, now faced a new enemy. The air itself was killing them. Forests that had not been touched by the direct effects of the impact burst into flames spontaneously. The heat was simply too much. Trees that had taken centuries to grow, that had provided homes for thousands of species, that had pumped oxygen into the atmosphere for millions of years, burned like matches. The smoke joined the dust already filling the sky. By evening, if you could call it evening, the sun was gone. Not set, gone. The debris cloud had spread so thick that no sunlight reached the surface anywhere on the planet. The world had been plunged into darkness, a darkness that would last for months, perhaps years. The temperature began to plummet. The heat of the fires gave way to a cold that would prove even more deadly. The first day ended not with a sunset, but with a surrender. The light simply gave up trying to reach the ground. The blue sky that had watched over the dinosaurs for 165 million years was now a memory, replaced by a ceiling of ash and dust and soot that stretched from horizon to horizon, from pole to pole. Beneath that ceiling, the dying began. Not the quick deaths of the impact zone. Those creatures had been fortunate in their way, erased so quickly they never knew what happened. No, this was slower. This was hunger and cold and suffocation. This was watching the world end and not being able to do anything about it. The plants died first. Without sunlight, photosynthesis stopped. The green things that had covered the continents began to wither within days. Leaves fell from trees that had been evergreen for millions of years. Ferns collapsed into brown mush. The flowering plants, those recent arrivals that had transformed the world, closed their blossoms for the last time. The herbivores followed. A triceratops can survive for weeks without food, living off its fat reserves, but weeks were not enough. The darkness lasted months. One by one, the great herds began to fall. The hadrosaurs, with their endless appetite for vegetation, starved first. The ankylosaurs, slower and more resilient, lasted longer, but not long enough. The bodies piled up, too many to count, too many to imagine. And when the herbivores died, the predators had nothing left to hunt. The Tyrannosaurus rex, king of the world for millions of years, was reduced to scavenging corpses, but even corpses run out. Even the greatest predator ever to walk the earth cannot survive when there is nothing left to eat. They grew thin, they grew weak, they grew desperate, and then they grew still. The night that fell on the day of the impact would last for a generation. By the time the skies finally cleared, by the time the sun finally broke through the poison clouds, the world would be unrecognizable. The forests would be gone. The great herds would be gone. The kings and queens of the Cretaceous would be nothing but bones buried in the ash, waiting for creatures that did not yet exist to dig them up and wonder. But that is the story of what came after. The story of the day itself, the day the sky fell and the earth caught fire, is complete. 66 million years ago, on a morning that began like any other, the world ended, and everything that exists today, including us, exists because of that ending. But the violence of that day had details that still haunt the imagination. The crater itself was a wound almost beyond description, 180 kilometers wide, 20 kilometers deep, a hole punched into the planet so vast that if you stood on one edge, you could not see the other. The walls of that crater were not rock anymore. They were glass, fused by temperatures that exceeded anything nature had produced since the Earth was young. At the center, where the asteroid had made contact, the rock had not just melted, it had vaporized, turned to gas in an instant. The pressure at the point of impact was so extreme that the laws of physics operated differently there. Minerals formed that do not occur naturally anywhere else on Earth. Crystals grew in microseconds that should have taken millennia. The violence was so complete that it created things that had never existed before. And the water, the shallow sea that had covered this spot for millions of years, was simply gone, not drained, not evaporated, deleted. The blast had converted it to plasma, scattered it across the atmosphere, mixed it with the rock and debris that was already spreading around the planet. The sea would eventually return, would fill the crater and cover it for millions of years, but on this day it ceased to exist. The animals that had lived in those waters left no trace. The ammonites, those beautiful spiral-shelled creatures that had ruled the seas for 300 million years, were among the victims. Some of them were larger than car tires, ancient and perfect, their shells decorated with ridges and patterns that still take our breath away when we find them fossilized. They had survived the worst extinction the planet had ever seen 250 million years earlier. They would not survive this one. The fish were luckier, in a sense. Many species lived deep enough in waters far enough from the impact that they survived the initial blast. But survival brought its own horrors. The oceans were changing. The water was becoming acidic as carbon dioxide from the fires dissolved into it. The temperature was fluctuating wildly. The food chain was collapsing from the bottom up as the plankton died in the darkness. For creatures that had evolved over millions of years to live in stable conditions, this chaos was unbearable. The great marine reptiles, the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, the rulers of the deep, found themselves in a world they no longer recognized. Their prey was disappearing. The water tasted wrong. The darkness that had fallen on the land had also fallen on the sea, blocking the light that filtered down even to great depths. They swam in circles, confused, starving, waiting for conditions to return to normal. They never did. On land, the fires burned for months. Every continent became a furnace. The heat released by the burning forests was so intense that it created its own weather systems. Firestorms that generated their own winds, their own lightning, their own rain that fell not as water but as mud mixed with ash and acid. Animals that tried to flee the flames found nowhere to run. The fires were everywhere. The smoke was everywhere. The darkness was everywhere. Those with the best sense of smell, which had once been an advantage, now suffered the most. The air was poison, thick with carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide and compounds that burned the lungs with every breath. The small creatures had the best chance. Not because they were smarter or faster or stronger, but because they needed less. A mouse-sized mammal could survive on a handful of insects. A frog could bury itself in mud and wait out the worst. A turtle could withdraw into its shell and slow its metabolism to almost nothing, surviving for months on the energy stored in its body. The giants could do none of these things. A Tyrannosaurus needed to eat hundreds of pounds of meat every week just to stay alive. In a world where there was no meat, where even the corpses had been consumed or buried under ash, that requirement became a death sentence. The great predators starved one by one, their magnificent bodies wasting away, their last days spent wandering through a landscape that offered nothing but death. Some of them may have turned on each other. Cannibalism is common among stressed predator populations. When there is nothing else to eat, flesh is flesh. We have no direct evidence of this for the final days of the dinosaurs, but the logic is inescapable. Starving tyrannosaurs meeting in the darkness, recognizing each other as the only source of protein left in the world. The fights would have been brutal, short, final. The winners would have survived a little longer, but only a little. The temperature continued to drop as the debris blocked more and more sunlight. The world that had been tropical from pole to pole was becoming something else. Frost appeared in places that had not seen frost for millions of years. Ice began to form on the edges of ponds that had never frozen. The cold-blooded creatures, the reptiles who depended on the sun to warm their bodies, felt their metabolism slowing, their movements becoming sluggish, their ability to hunt or flee disappearing. They fell asleep and did not wake up. The warm-blooded creatures lasted longer. The mammals, hidden in their burrows, could generate their own heat. The birds, descended from dinosaurs but different in crucial ways, could fluff their feathers and survive temperatures that would have killed their ancestors. These were the inheritors, though they did not know it yet. These were the ones who would walk out of the darkness and into a world that belonged to them. But that world was still years away. On this first day, on this day of fire and darkness and falling sky, there was only death. Death so complete, so overwhelming, so total that the planet itself seemed to be dying. The Earth that had nurtured life for 4 billion years was being transformed into something hostile to everything that lived. And yet, deep in a burrow, somewhere in what would become Montana, a small furry creature pressed against its siblings, sharing warmth, conserving energy, waiting. It did not understand what had happened. It could not know that the world above had ended. It only knew that it was cold and dark, and that the strange sounds that had shaken its world had finally stopped. It closed its eyes and slept, and in that sleep, in that small warm body, the future waited. The future that would eventually include cities and civilizations, art and science, love and war, everything that makes us human, all of it compressed into that tiny heartbeat, that fragile breath, that impossible survival against odds that should have been insurmountable. The dinosaurs were dying, but life was not. Life was just waiting for its next chance. The sun did not rise the next morning, or the morning after that, or the morning after that. For creatures who had lived their entire lives by the rhythm of light and dark, by the warmth of day and the cool of night, this was incomprehensible. The darkness was not like nighttime. Nighttime had stars, had the moon, had the faint glow of a sky that was merely resting. This darkness was absolute, total, a blindness that covered the entire world. The dust had won. Billions of tons of it now circled the Earth in the upper atmosphere, too high for rain to wash it down, too fine to settle on its own. It formed a shell around the planet, a cocoon of ash and soot and vaporized rock that turned day into night and night into something even deeper. The sun still burned, 93 million miles away, still poured its energy toward Earth. But that energy never reached the surface. It was absorbed, scattered, reflected back into space by a ceiling that had not existed 2 days before. Beneath that ceiling, the temperature was falling, not slowly like the change of seasons, rapidly, dangerously. In the tropics, where it had never been cold, frost appeared within weeks. In the temperate zones, snow began to fall on forests that had never known winter. At the poles, where ice already existed, the cold deepened into something that would kill anything that breathed. The impact, winter had begun. Scientists argue about how long it lasted. Some say months, some say years, some say the full effects lingered for decades, for centuries, for longer. But everyone agrees on one thing: it was long enough to kill almost everything that had survived the initial catastrophe. Long enough to end an era. Long enough to change the world forever. The plants felt it first. Without light, photosynthesis is impossible. The green things that covered the land, the forests and ferns and flowering plants that had transformed the planet, began to shut down within days. Their leaves, designed to capture sunlight, became useless weight. They dropped them. Trees that had been green for millions of years stood naked against a sky they could no longer see. Some plants had tricks. Seeds buried in the soil could wait. Bulbs, hidden underground, could survive on stored energy for months. Spores, scattered by the wind before the darkness fell, could lie dormant for years. These were the survivors, the gamblers who had bet on disaster and won. When the light finally returned, they would be ready. But the plants that were alive, that were growing, that needed sunlight now, had no such luck. They withered. They yellowed. They collapsed into rotting heaps that released their nutrients back into soil that had no use for them. The forests became graveyards. The meadows became wastelands. The swamps, once so thick with vegetation that walking through them was impossible, became open water, dotted with the corpses of drowned plants. The herbivores watched their food supply disappear. A triceratops can eat almost anything green. Its beak could strip bark from trees, its teeth could grind the toughest roots, its digestive system could extract nutrition from plants that would poison other animals. But even a triceratops cannot eat ash, cannot eat mud, cannot eat the memory of forests that no longer exist. They wandered, those great horned beasts, searching for something to fill their bellies. Their movements became slower as the cold sapped their energy. Their eyes became dull as starvation weakened them. They found patches of surviving vegetation sometimes, small valleys where some quirk of geography had protected a few ferns, a stand of conifers, something green. They stripped these places bare in hours and moved on looking for more. There was no more. The hadrosaurs, those duck-billed giants who had once filled the wetlands with their calls, were among the first to fall in large numbers. They needed more food than almost any other dinosaur, needed to eat constantly just to maintain their massive bodies. When the food ran out, they died standing up, too weak to lie down, frozen in place like monuments to their own extinction. The ankylosaurs lasted longer. Their armoured bodies conserved heat better than the naked skin of other dinosaurs. Their slow metabolism meant they needed less food. They could go weeks without eating, living off fat reserves that other species had burned through in days, but weeks were not enough. Months were not enough. One by one, they too stopped moving, their club tails resting on ground that would eventually bury them. The small dinosaurs adapted better at first. A Compsognathus, no bigger than a chicken, needed only a few insects to survive a day. In the early weeks of the darkness, insects were still available. They had survived worse extinctions before. They had survived everything. The little dinosaurs hunted them in the darkness, using senses other than sight to track their prey. But even insects need to eat. The beetles fed on dead wood, and there was plenty of that now. The flies fed on corpses, and there were more of those every day. But the insects that fed on living plants, on nectar and pollen and fresh leaves, had nothing. Their populations crashed. And when they crashed, everything that depended on them crashed too. The food web was unravelling from the bottom. In the seas, the same tragedy played out in different ways. The phytoplankton, those microscopic plants that form the foundation of all ocean life, needed light just like their cousins on land. In the darkness, they died by the trillions. Their tiny bodies sank to the ocean floor. A rain of death that continued for months, building layers of organic material that would eventually become oil and gas for creatures that did not yet exist. The zooplankton, the tiny animals that fed on phytoplankton, starved next. Then the small fish that fed on zooplankton, then the larger fish that fed on them, then the sharks and rays and marine reptiles that sat at the top of the food chain, suddenly finding themselves at the top of nothing. The mosasaurs, those magnificent sea serpents that had dominated the oceans for 20 million years, became desperate. They were warm-blooded, these creatures, a recent discovery that changed how we understand them. They could maintain their body temperature in cooling waters, could hunt in conditions that would have paralyzed cold-blooded competitors. But warm blood needs fuel, needs constant feeding, needs prey that was no longer there. They turned on each other. We have fossils that show this, mosasaur bones with bite marks from other mosasaurs, evidence of battles between hungry giants in darkening seas. The winners ate the losers and survived another week, another month, but eventually there were no more losers to eat, and then the winners died too. The plesiosaurs, those long-necked hunters that had patrolled the shallows for 100 million years, faced a different problem. They were not as warm-blooded as the mosasaurs, not as able to cope with falling temperatures. As the oceans cooled, their bodies slowed. Their hunts became clumsy, unsuccessful. They could not catch prey even when prey was available. They sank into the cold and did not rise again. In the rivers and lakes, the situation was slightly better. Freshwater ecosystems are more resilient than marine ones, more accustomed to fluctuation and change. The creatures that lived there had evolved to survive droughts and floods, freezes and heat waves. Some of them had the tools to survive this too. The crocodilians waited. They had been waiting for 200 million years, since before the dinosaurs rose to dominance, since the world was young and different. They knew how to survive, how to slow their metabolism to almost nothing, how to go months without food, how to bury themselves in mud and wait for conditions to improve. They buried themselves now. In riverbanks across the world, in the edges of swamps and the shallows of lakes, crocodiles and alligators and their relatives settled into the mud, closed their eyes, and entered a state that was not quite sleep and not quite death. Their hearts beat once a minute. Their lungs drew breath once an hour. They became living stones, patient beyond anything mammals would ever understand. They would wake up when the sun returned. The turtles did the same. Their shells, those miraculous structures that had protected them since before the dinosaurs existed, now served a new purpose. They were insulation. They were armor against the cold. Turtles could survive freezing, could survive starvation, could survive almost anything if they could find a place to hide. They found places. They hid. They survived. The freshwater fish had their own strategies. Some could survive in water so cold it should have killed them, their blood filled with natural antifreeze that kept ice crystals from forming in their cells. Some buried themselves in the bottom mud, where temperatures were more stable. Some simply died, but left eggs that were tougher than they were. Eggs that could wait out the winter and hatch when spring finally came. Spring would come, eventually, but not yet. On land, the survivors were the small and the hidden. The mammals, those furry creatures that had lived in the shadows of the dinosaurs for over 100 million years, were suddenly finding that their lifestyle had advantages. They were warm-blooded, which meant they could stay active in the cold. They were small, which meant they needed less food. They were burrowers, which meant they had shelter from the worst conditions. They huddled in their underground homes and waited. Some of them ate seeds which were still available in the soil, buried by winds and floods in the years before the impact. Some of them ate insects, which were still findable if you knew where to look. Some of them ate each other, the desperate mathematics of survival reducing populations, but keeping the species alive. The birds had different advantages. They could fly, which meant they could search for food over vast distances. They could fluff their feathers for insulation, creating pockets of warm air that protected them from the cold. They could eat almost anything, from seeds to insects to carrion to each other. And they were descendants of dinosaurs, inheritors of 100 million years of evolution that had prepared them for exactly this moment. They did not know they were the only dinosaurs that would survive. To them, survival was not symbolic. It was not destiny. It was just the daily struggle to find enough calories to make it through another night. They flew through the darkness, guided by senses we do not fully understand, and they found enough. Barely, but enough. The months passed. The dust began to settle, slowly, gradually, imperceptibly at first. The sky went from black to dark grey, from dark grey to grey, from grey to something that might, if you squinted, be called lighter grey. The first rays of sunlight reached the surface in places, weak and diffuse, barely enough to cast a shadow, but it was light. The plants that had survived as seeds felt it first. Something stirred in their chemistry, some ancient response to wavelengths they had not experienced in months. They began to wake up, to push roots downward and shoots upward, to reach for a sun they could not see, but somehow knew was there. Life was beginning to return. But for the dinosaurs, the giant ones, the magnificent ones, the ones who had ruled the earth since before the mountains were tall, it was too late. They were already gone. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic extinction event, but one by one, species by species, individual by individual. The last Tyrannosaurus died somewhere, at some moment, and there was no one to mark its passing. The last Triceratops fell somewhere, and no eye witnessed its end. The last Pteranodon folded its wings for the final time, and the skies became empty of giants forever. The world they had built, the ecosystems they had dominated, the roles they had played for 165 million years, all of it ended in the darkness and cold of a winter that should never have happened. And when the sun finally broke through, when the skies finally cleared, when warmth finally returned to a planet that had nearly frozen solid, the creatures that emerged to greet it were not the ones that had dominated before. They were smaller, furrier, feathered. They were the survivors. They were the beginning of everything that would come next. And high above them, visible again for the first time in months, the stars shone down on a world that had been transformed. The age of dinosaurs was over. The age of something new was about to begin, but the dying was not yet complete. In isolated pockets around the world, small populations of dinosaurs still clung to existence. These were the lucky ones, if you could call them lucky. They had found sheltered valleys where some vegetation survived. They had stumbled upon thermal vents where volcanic heat kept the ground warm. They had discovered caves where the temperature remained stable and fungus grew on the walls. These were the holdouts, the last survivors of a dynasty that had lasted longer than any other in Earth's history. In what would become Antarctica, which was not yet frozen, a small group of ornithopods huddled together for warmth. This land had always been dark for part of the year, always experienced long winters when the sun barely rose. The dinosaurs here had evolved to cope with cold and darkness in ways their northern cousins had not. They had larger eyes, denser feathers, slower metabolisms. They lasted longer than most. But even Antarctic dinosaurs needed to eat, and the vegetation they depended on was dying, killed by the same darkness that was killing plants everywhere else. They grew thinner, weaker. Their eggs, laid in hope during a brief period of warmth, never hatched. The shells were too thin, weakened by the lack of calcium in their diet. The embryos inside died before they could see the world that was ending around them. The last of them probably died within a year of the impact. Somewhere, alone, in the dark, in the highlands of what would become India, another group survived a little longer. The Deccan Traps, those massive volcanic formations that had been erupting for nearly 1 million years before the impact, provided something unexpected: heat. The lava flows, though deadly up close, warmed the surrounding land. Plants grew in the volcanic soil, hardy species that could tolerate the toxic gases and harsh conditions. A few dinosaurs found this refuge. Small ones, mostly, species that could survive on limited resources and did not need vast territories. They lived in the shadow of the volcanoes, eating whatever grew, drinking from streams that were warmer than they should have been. The ash in the air was nothing new to them. They had been breathing volcanic fumes their entire lives, but the volcanoes were dying too. The same eruptions that had stressed the planet for 1 million years were finally winding down. The heat was fading, the refuge was shrinking, and the dinosaurs that had sheltered there found themselves trapped between cooling lava fields and a frozen world that offered nothing. They did not leave descendants. In the isolated island chains that dotted the ancient oceans, evolution had produced strange forms. Dwarf dinosaurs, shrunk by limited resources, giant flightless birds, grown large in the absence of predators, creatures that existed nowhere else, that had evolved in isolation for millions of years, that were utterly unprepared for what was happening. Islands are always vulnerable. The populations are small, the genetic diversity is low, the resources are limited. When disaster strikes, there is nowhere to flee, no other population to merge with, no way to escape the mathematics of extinction. The island dinosaurs died quickly, their small numbers collapsing to zero in months rather than years. Some of them we will never know existed. Their bones sank into tropical mud, were washed away by storms, were consumed by the same processes of decay that claimed everything else. They left no fossils, no trace, no memory. They simply vanished, as if they had never been. The pterosaurs faced their own particular horror. These were not dinosaurs, though they are often confused with them. They were a separate lineage, flying reptiles that had evolved wings millions of years before birds existed. They had ruled the skies for 150 million years, had grown to sizes that seem impossible, had developed ways of flying that we still do not fully understand. But they had a weakness. The largest pterosaurs, the Quetzalcoatlus and Hatzegopteryx, with wingspans that exceeded 30 feet, needed thermals to fly. They were too large to generate enough lift by flapping alone. They depended on rising columns of warm air to carry them aloft, to keep them airborne for hours without effort. The impact winter killed the thermals. Without sunlight warming the ground, without temperature differences creating rising air, the giant pterosaurs were grounded. They could not fly, they could not hunt, they could not escape predators or search for food or do any of the things that flying had allowed them to do for their entire evolutionary history. They walked awkwardly on legs that were not designed for walking. They starved slowly in bodies that were designed for a world that no longer existed. The smaller pterosaurs lasted longer, but not long enough. They could still fly in the cold air, could still hunt the insects that remained, could still find shelter in caves and cliffs, but they too depended on a food chain that was collapsing. They too needed more calories than the dying world could provide. The last pterosaur probably died within 5 years of the impact. Somewhere, clinging to a cliff face, its wings folded against the cold, waiting for a dawn that would never bring warmth again. The seas took longer to empty. Water holds heat better than air. The oceans, warmed by millions of years of tropical sun, did not cool as quickly as the land. The marine reptiles, the fish, the invertebrates, they had a buffer that the land animals lacked. They had time, but time, in the end, was not enough. The ammonites, those beautiful spiral-shelled creatures that had survived for 300 million years, died completely. Every species, every population, every individual, they had survived the Permian extinction, the worst disaster in Earth's history, but they could not survive this. Their shells, made of aragonite, dissolved in the acidifying waters. Their prey, the plankton they filtered from the sea, disappeared with the light. They left behind only fossils, beautiful spiralling fossils that would one day decorate museums and inspire wonder in creatures that did not yet exist. The belemnites died too, those squid-like animals that had filled the same role in Mesozoic oceans that squid fill today. Their internal shells, bullet-shaped and hard, would survive as fossils, but the animals themselves would not see the world that emerged from the darkness. The rudists, those strange reef-building clams that had replaced corals as the architects of tropical seas, vanished entirely. Their massive colonies, which had grown for millions of years, bleached and died and crumbled into sand. The reefs they had built became ghost towns, haunted by the few fish and invertebrates that could survive in a world without structure. Even the sharks suffered. Sharks had existed for 400 million years. They had survived extinctions that killed almost everything else. They were survivors, adapters, the ultimate generalists in a world that rewarded specialization. But this extinction was different. This extinction attacked the base of the food chain, removed the foundation that everything else depended on. Shark diversity crashed. Species that had patrolled the oceans since before the dinosaurs existed disappeared forever. Only the smallest, the most adaptable, the ones that could survive on scraps and carrion and whatever else they could find, made it through. They would recover, eventually would diversify again into the hundreds of species that exist today, but that recovery would take millions of years. The seafloor became a graveyard. The constant rain of dead plankton, dead fish, dead everything built layers of organic material that would eventually become the oil deposits we drill today. Future civilizations would burn the concentrated remains of Cretaceous death to power their machines, never knowing that every gallon of gasoline contained the ghosts of creatures that had died in the darkness 66 million years ago. On land, the forests were being replaced by something new. Ferns, hardy, primitive, able to survive on almost nothing. They spread across the burned and frozen landscape like a green blanket, the first plants to reclaim the territory that the flowering plants had conquered only millions of years before. The fern spike, scientists call it, a layer in the fossil record where fern spores dominate everything else. It is the signature of recovery. Wherever we find that fern spike, we know we are looking at the aftermath of the impact. It appears all over the world, on every continent, at the same layer in the rock. It is the botanical equivalent of a reset button, the Earth starting over from scratch with the simplest, toughest plants it had. The ferns did not mind the cold, they did not mind the darkness, they did not mind the ash and the acid rain and the poisoned soil. They simply grew, sending their fronds up toward a sun they trusted would return, anchoring their roots in soil that would one day support forests again. They were the pioneers, the first wave of a recovery that would take millions of years to complete. And beneath them, in burrows and caves and crevices, the survivors waited. The mammals, the birds, the crocodiles and turtles and frogs, the future. They did not know they were the future. They only knew they were alive, and that staying alive required constant effort, constant vigilance, constant struggle against a world that seemed determined to kill them. But they were alive, and that was enough. The first sunrise after the darkness was not golden. It was grey, weak, a pale smear of light that barely penetrated the haze still hanging in the upper atmosphere. But it was sunrise, after months of nothing, after an endless night that had seemed like it would last forever. The sun had returned, nothing celebrated. The world was too broken for celebration. The forests that had once echoed with the calls of dinosaurs were silent. The plains that had thundered with the footsteps of giants were still. The skies that had been filled with wings were empty. The only sound was the wind, carrying ash across landscapes that looked like the surface of the moon. But beneath that silence, something was stirring. In a burrow 3 feet underground, a small mammal opened its eyes. It had been living in darkness for so long that its eyes had adjusted, pupils dilated permanently wide, able to detect the faintest trace of light. And now there was light, faint, grey, barely there, but light. It crept toward the entrance of its burrow and looked out at a world transformed. The trees were gone. Not just the leaves, but the trees themselves, toppled and burned and reduced to charcoal skeletons that pointed at the sky like accusing fingers. The ground was covered in a layer of grey ash, inches thick in some places, feet thick in others. Nothing green was visible, nothing alive was moving, but the air was warmer than it had been. The mammal, a creature no bigger than a modern rat, took its first breath of air that did not taste like poison. The sulphur was fading, the smoke was clearing, the world was still dead, but it was becoming less deadly. It stepped out into the light. This moment, this single step by a single small creature, was one of the most important in the history of life on Earth, because this mammal, and millions like it emerging from burrows and caves and crevices all over the world, were about to inherit a planet. They did not know this. They only knew they were hungry. The first weeks after the darkness lifted were desperate times. The survivors had depleted their fat reserves, had eaten everything edible within reach of their shelters, had grown thin and weak waiting for conditions to improve. Now conditions were improving, but food was still scarce. The ferns helped. Those primitive plants spreading across the burned landscape were producing spores by the billions. The spores were not nutritious by themselves, but they attracted insects, and insects attracted the small predators that had survived. A food chain was rebuilding itself, link by link, in the ruins of the old world. The mammals learned to follow the ferns. Wherever the green spread, life followed. First the insects, then the small mammals that ate them, then the slightly larger mammals that ate the smaller ones. It was a simple ecosystem, nothing like the complex web that had existed before the impact, but it was functional, it was growing, it was alive, the birds were doing even better. They could fly, which meant they could search vast areas for food. They could spot patches of recovery from high above, could identify fruiting plants and insect swarms and carrion from distances that earthbound creatures could not match. They became the scouts of the New World, the first to find resources and the first to exploit them. Some of them were already changing. The birds that survived the extinction were not the largest or the most specialized. They were the generalists, the omnivores, the ones who could eat anything and live anywhere. In the aftermath, with no competition from pterosaurs, with no giant predators to fear, they began to experiment, to diversify, to fill niches that had been empty since the dinosaurs died. On isolated islands, some birds stopped flying. Without predators, flight was expensive. It required energy that could be better spent on growing larger, on producing more eggs, on dominating territory. These birds grew, their wings shrank, their legs thickened. They became something new, ground-dwelling giants that would rule their islands for millions of years. On the continents, other birds went in the opposite direction. They became smaller, faster, more agile. They developed new songs to attract mates, new colors to signal fitness, new behaviors to exploit new food sources. The silence that had followed the extinction was slowly filling with birdsong, tentative at first, then louder, then constant. The world was finding its voice again. The recovery was not even. Some places bounced back quickly. River valleys where water had protected seeds and sheltered survivors turned green within years. Coastal areas where marine nutrients washed ashore developed new ecosystems almost immediately. Volcanic regions where heat had never stopped flowing from the earth became oases of life in a recovering desert. Other places took longer. The interior of continents, far from water, far from volcanic heat, far from any source of renewal, remained barren for decades. The ash was too thick, the soil was too damaged, the seeds that might have sprouted had been destroyed by fire or buried too deep to germinate. These places would recover eventually, but eventually was a long time coming. The oceans recovered in their own way. The surface waters, poisoned and acidified by the impact, cleared first. Rain fell, endless rain in the years after the impact, washing the ash from the sky and diluting the toxins in the sea. The phytoplankton returned, those microscopic plants that form the foundation of ocean life, blooming in waters that were finally clear enough for photosynthesis. The blooms were enormous. Without anything to eat them, the phytoplankton multiplied beyond anything the pre-impact oceans had seen. They turned the seas green, then brown, then red with their sheer abundance. They pumped oxygen into an atmosphere that had been choked with carbon dioxide. They began the slow process of healing a planet that had nearly died. The zooplankton followed. Then the small fish, then the larger fish. Then the sharks, those survivors of so many previous extinctions, finally finding prey worth hunting again. The oceans refilled with life, not the same life that had existed before, but life nonetheless. The reefs took longest. Coral grows slowly, adding millimeters per year to structures that take centuries to build. The reefs that had been bleached and killed by the impact would not recover for millions of years. New coral would settle on the dead skeletons of the old, would build upon foundations laid down in a world that no longer existed, would eventually create new reefs as magnificent as anything that had come before. But that was far in the future. In the immediate aftermath, the oceans were reefless. The complex ecosystems that had depended on coral structure were gone, replaced by simpler communities that could survive in open water. The fish that had hidden in reef crevices, the crustaceans that had lived among the coral branches, the countless species that had called the reefs home, they were gone. New species would evolve to fill their places, but evolution takes time. On land, the mammals were not waiting. They were expanding, diversifying, filling every available niche with an urgency that seems almost desperate in hindsight. Within a few 100,000 years, an eye blink in geological time, they had produced forms that would have been unrecognizable to their Cretaceous ancestors. Some grew larger, Without dinosaurs to compete with, size was suddenly an option. Mammals that had been mouse-sized for 100 million years began to grow. Their descendants would become as large as bears within a few million years, as large as elephants within a few million more. The age of giant mammals had begun. Some became predators. The ecological role of the Tyrannosaurus, the apex predator, the killer of giants, was vacant. Mammals began to fill it, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. Early predatory mammals were small by later standards, wolf-sized at most, but they were efficient. They hunted in packs. They used intelligence to compensate for what they lacked in size. Some took to the trees. The forests were regrowing, different from the forests that had existed before, but forests nonetheless. Flowering plants dominated now, producing fruits and nuts that had not existed in such abundance during the age of dinosaurs. Mammals that could climb, that could reach these new food sources, thrived. Their descendants would one day include us. Some returned to the sea. This would take longer, tens of millions of years, but it would happen. Mammals that had evolved on land would wade into shallow waters, would learn to hunt fish, would gradually transform their legs into flippers and their tails into flukes. They would become whales and dolphins and seals, reclaiming an ocean that reptiles had once ruled. The world was reorganizing itself. Every extinction creates opportunities. Every disaster opens doors. The dinosaurs had dominated for so long, had filled so many niches so completely that other groups had been locked out of possibilities that were now suddenly available. The mammals seized these possibilities with an enthusiasm that transformed the planet, but they were not alone. The crocodilians emerged from their muddy tombs and found a world that suited them perfectly. Warm, wet, filled with prey that had not yet learned to fear them. They had survived the extinction almost unchanged, and they would remain almost unchanged for millions of years more. Evolution had perfected them long ago. There was no need to improve. The turtles crawled out of their shells and resumed lives that had been interrupted but not ended. They were survivors too, ancient lineages that had outlasted the dinosaurs and would outlast whatever came next. They moved slowly through a world that was speeding up around them, unchanged and unchanging. The snakes, those legless descendants of lizards, found new opportunities in the post-extinction world. Small mammals made excellent prey. Burrows made excellent homes. The darkness that had killed the dinosaurs had not bothered creatures that hunted by heat and vibration rather than sight. They diversified rapidly, filling niches that had not existed when larger predators dominated. The lizards adapted too. Some grew larger, filling the role of medium-sized predators that mammals had not yet claimed. Some developed new ways of hunting, new ways of hiding, new ways of surviving in a world that was changing faster than it ever had before. They would never again dominate the land as their dinosaur cousins had, but they would persist, would thrive, would remain a vital part of ecosystems worldwide. The insects, as always, survived everything. They had survived the Permian extinction, which killed 90% of all species. They had survived the Triassic extinction, which cleared the way for the dinosaurs. They had survived the impact winter, hiding in soil and wood and water, waiting for conditions to improve. Now, conditions were improving, and they exploded back into every available habitat. New relationships formed. The flowering plants which had been spreading before the extinction now dominated. They needed pollinators. The insects needed food. A partnership that had begun millions of years earlier now became the foundation of terrestrial ecosystems worldwide. Bees and butterflies and beetles spread pollen from flower to flower, enabling the reproduction of plants that would feed the world. The world was healing. not returning to what it had been. That world was gone forever, as lost as the dinosaurs themselves, but becoming something new, something different, something that would eventually produce creatures capable of looking back at this moment and wondering what it had been like. The recovery took millions of years. 10 million years after the impact, the Earth was green again. Forests covered the continents, grasslands, a new invention spread across the plains. The oceans teemed with fish and whales and sharks that had never seen a mosasaur. The skies were filled with birds that had never competed with pterosaurs. It was a new world, a mammal world, a world that was slowly, inexorably, inevitably moving toward us. The dinosaurs were not forgotten. Their bones lay buried in the rock, waiting to be discovered. Their descendants flew overhead, singing songs that echoed with 100 million years of evolution. Their legacy lived on in every bird, every crocodile, every creature that traced its ancestry back to the Mesozoic. But their reign was over. The throne of the earth had passed to new rulers. Furry, warm-blooded, adaptable rulers who would one day build cities and write histories and wonder about the giants who had come before them. The age of mammals had begun, and it would lead, eventually, impossibly, inevitably, to us. But between that first sunrise and our own existence stretched an ocean of time so vast that the mind struggles to comprehend it. 66 million years. If the entire history of mammals after the extinction were compressed into a single day, humans would appear in the final minute before midnight. Everything else, all the transformation and diversification and evolution that made us possible, happened in the hours before. The first million years were the hardest. The planet was wounded in ways that took generations to heal. The soil was poisoned with heavy metals thrown up by the impact. The water cycles were disrupted, producing droughts in some places and floods in others. The climate swung wildly, unable to find equilibrium after the catastrophic forcing it had experienced. The survivors adapted or died. Natural selection, that blind sculptor of life, worked overtime in the post-extinction world. Every generation faced challenges that would have been unthinkable in the stable ecosystems of the Cretaceous. Food was scarce. Predators were everywhere. The rules that had governed survival for 100 million years no longer applied. New rules emerged. Intelligence became more valuable than ever before. Mammals that could remember where food had been found, that could learn from the experiences of others, that could solve problems their ancestors had never faced. These mammals thrived. Their brains grew larger, relative to their bodies, than the brains of any Mesozoic mammal had been. This was the beginning of something important. Social behaviour intensified too. Mammals that lived in groups could share information about food sources, could protect each other from predators, could raise offspring cooperatively. The loners, the solitary hunters that had dominated mammalian lifestyles during the age of dinosaurs, found themselves outcompeted by species that worked together. The foundations of our own social nature were being laid. 5 million years after the impact, the world was almost unrecognizable. The continents had not moved much, were still in roughly the positions they had occupied when the asteroid struck, but everything on them had changed. The vegetation was different, dominated by flowering plants that produced fruits and seeds in abundance. The animals were different, mammals of shapes and sizes that had never existed before. The Paleocene epoch, scientists call this time, the ancient New Age, a world emerging from disaster, experimenting with possibilities, trying on new forms like costumes at a carnival. Some experiments succeeded spectacularly. The hoofed mammals appeared, ancestors of horses and deer and cattle and pigs. They evolved teeth that could grind tough plant material, legs that could carry them across open ground at speed, digestive systems that could extract nutrition from vegetation that other animals could not eat. They would eventually become the dominant large herbivores on most continents. The primates appeared too. Small, tree-dwelling creatures with grasping hands and forward-facing eyes. They were not impressive by the standards of their time, just another group of mammals filling a niche in the recovering forests. But they had potential. They had hands that could manipulate objects, eyes that could judge distances, brains that could process complex visual information. They were the beginning of us. Other experiments failed. Strange mammals that look like nothing alive today wandered the Paleocene world. The pantodonts, massive herbivores with tusks and claws, ruled some ecosystems for millions of years before disappearing completely. The taniodonts, with their rodent-like teeth and bear-like bodies, left no descendants. The tilodonts, the condylarths, the dozens of groups whose names mean nothing to us because they led nowhere. Evolution does not have a plan. It tries everything, and most things fail. The forms that succeed, the lineages that persist, are not superior in any absolute sense. They are simply suited to the conditions that happen to exist at the moment. When conditions change, the winners can become losers overnight. The dinosaurs had learned this lesson the hard way. The mammals would learn it too, in their own time. 20 million years after the impact, the world had transformed again. The climate had warmed considerably. Tropical forests covered much of the northern hemisphere, reaching almost to the poles. Palm trees grew in what is now Alaska. Crocodiles swam in waters that would one day be frozen. It was a greenhouse world, powered by volcanic gases and orbital variations that pushed temperatures higher than they had been since before the extinction. The mammals responded by growing. Without ice at the poles to limit growth, without harsh winters to survive, without any constraint except the availability of food, some mammalian lineages became truly enormous. The first giants appeared, ancestors of elephants and their relatives browsing on the abundant vegetation of the tropical forests. The predators grew to match. Creodonts, a group of carnivores now completely extinct, produced species that rivaled the largest tyrannosaurs in size. They had massive jaws, bone-crushing teeth, bodies built for power rather than speed. They were the apex predators of their age, feared by every other animal that walked the earth. They would not last. Nothing lasts forever. That is the lesson of the fossil record, written in the bones of 1 billion extinct species. Every dominant group eventually falls, replaced by something new, something better adapted to conditions that the old rulers never anticipated. The creodonts would give way to the true carnivores, the ancestors of cats and dogs and bears. The pantodonts would give way to the true herbivores, the ancestors of elephants and horses and cattle. The world would keep changing, keep experimenting, keep producing new forms to replace the old. 30 million years after the impact, the planet cooled again. Antarctica had drifted over the South Pole, had become isolated from other continents, had begun to develop the ice sheet that would eventually cover it entirely. Ocean currents changed as the southern continent froze, carrying cold water around the globe, moderating temperatures everywhere. The tropical paradise was ending. Forests retreated toward the equator, grasslands spread across the continental interiors, a new type of ecosystem that had not existed in the age of dinosaurs. The mammals that had thrived in the warm forests found themselves struggling in the cooler, drier conditions. New mammals took their place. Horses evolved to run on the open plains, their legs lengthening, their toes fusing into hooves, their teeth becoming grinding machines capable of processing the tough silica-rich grasses. Antelope and deer and cattle evolved similar adaptations, filling the grasslands with herds that darkened the horizon. The predators evolved to catch them. Cats became faster, developing the sprint hunting technique that lions and cheetahs still use today. Dogs became endurance hunters, capable of running for hours until their prey collapsed from exhaustion. The arms race between hunter and hunted intensified, producing the magnificent forms that would eventually share the world with us. 40 million years after the impact, the primates made a crucial leap. Some of them came down from the trees. The forests were shrinking, giving way to savannas and grasslands. The primates that could survive on the ground, that could walk upright to see over the tall grass, that could use their freed hands to carry food and tools and babies, these primates thrived where their tree-dwelling cousins struggled. They were still not human. They were not even close to human, but they were moving in a direction that would eventually, after millions more years of evolution, produce creatures capable of understanding what had happened on that day 66 million years before. 50 million years after the impact, the world was beginning to look familiar. The continents were approaching their modern positions. India had crashed into Asia, raising the Himalayas. Africa was pushing into Europe, creating the Alps. The Atlantic Ocean was widening, separating the old world from the new. The geography of our world was taking shape. The animals were becoming familiar too. Elephants that looked like elephants, horses that looked like horses, cats and dogs and bears and deer and pigs, all recognizable, all filling the same roles they fill today. The age of modern mammals had arrived, and somewhere in Africa, a population of apes was beginning to experiment with a new way of life. Walking upright, using tools, communicating with sounds that carried meaning beyond the immediate moment. They were not yet human. They would not be human for millions of years, but they were on the path, that long and winding path that would eventually lead to creatures who could look back at the day the dinosaurs died and understand what it meant. The asteroid had cleared the stage, the mammals had written a new play, and the final act was about to begin. For 65 million years the secret lay buried in rock, buried in sediment, buried beneath oceans and mountains and the accumulated weight of time itself. The story of the worst day in Earth's history was written in stone, but no one could read it. No one even knew there was something to read. The dinosaurs became legends before they became science. Ancient peoples found their bones and wondered. The Chinese thought they were dragons. The Greeks thought they were giants. Medieval Europeans thought they were the remains of creatures drowned in Noah's flood. Everyone who looked at these massive bones knew they were seeing something extraordinary, but no one understood what. Then, in the early 1800s, everything changed. A young Englishwoman named Mary Anning began collecting fossils from the cliffs of Lyme Regis on the southern coast of England. She was not wealthy, she was not educated in the formal sense. She was simply curious and persistent and blessed with an eye for finding things that had been hidden for millions of years. She found monsters. Ichthyosaurs, those dolphin-shaped marine reptiles that had ruled the Jurassic seas. Plesiosaurs, with their impossible necks and tiny heads. Pterosaurs, the flying reptiles that had owned the skies. She pulled them from the rock one bone at a time, reassembling creatures that no human had ever seen, proving that the world had once been home to animals beyond imagination. The scientific world took notice. In 1842, a British anatomist named Richard Owen looked at the growing collection of giant reptile fossils and realised they belonged to a distinct group. He needed a name for them. He combined two Greek words, deinos and sauros, and created a term that would echo through history: dinosauria, terrible lizards. The dinosaurs had a name, but they did not yet have an ending. The scientists of the 19th century knew the dinosaurs were gone. The fossils stopped appearing at a certain level in the rock, and above that level there was nothing. No tyrannosaurs, no triceratops, no giant reptiles of any kind. Something had happened to end their reign, but what? Theories multiplied. Perhaps they had been outcompeted by mammals. Perhaps they had been killed by disease. Perhaps the climate had changed gradually, making the world unsuitable for cold-blooded giants. Perhaps they had simply grown too large, too specialized, too committed to ways of life that no longer worked. None of these theories quite fit the evidence. The disappearance was too sudden, too complete, too global. Whatever had killed the dinosaurs had killed them everywhere, on every continent, in every ecosystem, all at roughly the same time. Gradual processes do not work that way. Gradual processes leave survivors, leave stragglers, leave populations that hang on in refuges while the main groups decline. The dinosaurs left nothing. For over a century, this mystery haunted paleontology. The greatest success story in the history of life, a group that had dominated the planet for longer than any other, had vanished almost overnight, and no one knew why. The answer came from an unexpected direction. In 1977, a geologist named Walter Alvarez was working in Italy studying a layer of clay near the town of Gubbio. This clay marked the boundary between two geological periods, the Cretaceous and the Paleogene. Below the clay, fossils of Cretaceous life. Above it, fossils of the Paleogene recovery. The clay itself was the moment of transition, the geological instant when one world ended and another began. Alvarez wanted to know how long that instant had lasted. He brought samples of the clay to his father, Luis Alvarez, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist at Berkeley. The elder Alvarez suggested measuring the amount of iridium in the clay. Iridium is rare on Earth but common in meteorites, and it falls from space at a constant rate. By measuring how much had accumulated in the boundary clay, they could estimate how long the clay had taken to form. The results made no sense. The clay contained 30 times more iridium than it should have. Not just a little more, but vastly, impossibly more. Iridium at concentrations that could not be explained by normal accumulation over any reasonable time period, unless something extraordinary had happened. Luis Alvarez, the physicist, saw immediately what the iridium meant. This was not background accumulation. This was a spike, a sudden, massive injection of extraterrestrial material into the Earth's environment. The only thing that could produce such a spike was an impact, a collision between Earth and something from space, something very, very large from space. In 1980, the Alvarez team published their hypothesis. 66 million years ago, they proposed, an asteroid roughly 10 kilometers in diameter had struck the Earth. The impact had thrown billions of tons of debris into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight, killing plants, collapsing food chains, and driving the dinosaurs to extinction. The scientific world exploded. Paleontologists hated the idea. They had spent their careers studying gradual evolutionary processes, had built their understanding of extinction around slow changes in climate and competition and ecology, the notion that everything could end in a single bad day. That 165 million years of evolutionary success could be erased by a random rock from space felt wrong. It felt catastrophist. It felt like giving up on the careful, methodical science they had devoted their lives to. The debate raged for a decade. Critics pointed out that there was no crater. If an asteroid 10 kilometers wide had struck the Earth, it should have left a hole 100 miles across. Where was this hole? The Alvarezes could not answer. The impact site, wherever it was, had either been destroyed by geological processes or remained undiscovered. The iridium layer kept showing up. Scientists found it everywhere they looked, in Denmark, in New Zealand, in deep sea cores from every ocean. The spike was global, consistent, undeniable. Something had deposited iridium all over the planet at exactly the moment the dinosaurs disappeared. The correlation was too precise to be coincidence. But correlation is not causation. Without a crater, the hypothesis remained incomplete. Then, in 1991, the crater was found. It had been hiding in plain sight for decades. In the 1950s, geologists working for the Mexican oil company Pemex had drilled into an unusual circular structure beneath the Yucatan Peninsula. The structure was buried under hundreds of meters of sediment, invisible from the surface, detectable only through the strange patterns it created in gravity measurements and seismic surveys. The Pemex geologists thought it was a volcanic feature. They filed their reports and moved on to other projects. The reports sat in archives, unread, unremarkable, while the debate about dinosaur extinction raged in universities around the world. A journalist and a geologist changed everything. Alan Hildebrand, a graduate student studying impact craters, had been searching for the Chicxulub site for years. He knew from the distribution of impact debris that the crater should be somewhere in the Caribbean region. He had narrowed it down to an area that included the Yucatan. But he could not find the crater itself. Carlos Baez, a journalist in Houston, heard about Hildebrand's search and remembered a talk he had attended years earlier. A Pemex geologist had mentioned an unusual circular structure beneath the Yucatan. Baez connected the two pieces of information and passed the tip to Hildebrand. The crater was exactly where it should have been. 180 kilometers wide, centered on a small fishing village called Chicxulub Puerto, buried under a kilometer of limestone deposited in the 66 million years since the impact. The wound that had killed the dinosaurs had healed over, hidden by time, waiting to be discovered by creatures that owed their existence to its violence. The debate was over. Not immediately, of course. Science does not work that way. There were still skeptics, still alternative theories, still researchers who insisted that volcanoes or climate change or some other gradual process deserved the blame, but the evidence kept mounting. The crater was real. The timing was exact. The physics worked. An asteroid had killed the dinosaurs. The discovery transformed our understanding of Earth's history. For 2 centuries, geologists had believed that the planet changed slowly, gradually, through processes that could be observed in the present and extrapolated into the past. Catastrophes were dismissed as unscientific, as appeals to divine intervention, as lazy explanations that avoided the hard work of understanding gradual change. Chicxulub proved that catastrophes happen. Not often, not predictably, but when they do, they change everything. The history of life is not a steady march of progress. It is a series of experiments punctuated by disasters that clear the board and start the game over. The dinosaurs had been winning. Then the rules changed. The impact hypothesis opened new questions. How exactly had the asteroid killed so many species? What were the specific mechanisms of death? How had some creatures survived while others perished? The discovery of the crater was the beginning of understanding, not the end. Scientists began to reconstruct the day itself. Using computer models and geological evidence and the physics of high-velocity impacts, they pieced together what had happened in those first seconds, minutes, hours, days. The picture that emerged was more terrifying than anyone had imagined. The asteroid had struck at an angle from the northeast at roughly 60 degrees. This angle maximised the amount of debris thrown into the atmosphere, maximised the climate effects, maximised the destruction. A steeper angle would have been less deadly. A shallower angle might have caused the asteroid to skip off the atmosphere entirely. The dinosaurs had lost a cosmic lottery. The impact site made things worse. The Yucatan platform was made of limestone and gypsum, sedimentary rocks rich in carbon and sulfur. When these rocks vaporized, they released carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere in quantities that dwarfed any volcanic eruption. The sulfur combined with water to form sulfuric acid, which fell as acid rain. The carbon dioxide trapped heat, then cold, as the climate whipsawed between extremes. A different impact site might have been survivable. An impact in the deep ocean or on a continent made of granite would have been devastating, but not necessarily extinction level. The dinosaurs were killed not just by an asteroid, but by an asteroid that hit the worst possible place, at the worst possible angle, at the worst possible moment. Bad luck does not begin to describe it. The investigation continued. Scientists found shocked quartz at sites around the world, crystals whose structure had been deformed by pressures that only exist in nuclear explosions or asteroid impacts. They found tiny glass spheres called tektites formed when molten rock was thrown into space and cooled as it fell back to Earth. They found layers of soot that spoke of global wildfires, layers of clay that spoke of oceanic disruption, layers of death written in the language of geology. Every piece of evidence told the same story, the story of a day that changed the world, the story of an ending that made possible a beginning, the story that you are hearing now, pieced together over 2 centuries by thousands of scientists working in dozens of disciplines, each contributing a fragment to a picture that finally, impossibly, magnificently makes sense. We know what happened. We know when it happened. We know where it happened. We know how it happened. We know, as well as we can know anything about the deep past, what it was like to be alive on the day the sky fell, and we know something else. We know that it could happen again. The solar system is full of rocks, asteroids and comets. Debris left over from the formation of the planets still circle the sun in orbits that sometimes cross Earth's path. Most of them are small pebbles and boulders that burn up in the atmosphere and become nothing more than shooting stars. But some of them are not small. Some of them are large enough to end civilizations, large enough to trigger extinctions, large enough to do to us what was done to the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. The difference is that we can see them coming. For the first time in the history of life on this planet, a species exists that can track the objects that might destroy it, that can calculate their orbits, predict their approaches, possibly even deflect them before they arrive. We are not helpless the way the dinosaurs were helpless. We have telescopes, we have rockets, we have mathematics, we have a chance. The dinosaurs ruled for 165 million years and never developed the ability to look up and understand what they were seeing. We have existed for 300,000 years, and we have already built machines that can peer into the depths of space and catalogue the threats that lurk there. That is not nothing. That is something extraordinary, something unprecedented in the 4 billion year history of life on Earth, the ability to see disaster coming and do something about it. Whether we use that ability, whether we take seriously the threat that ended the dinosaurs and could end us, that is a question only we can answer. The asteroid did not care about the dinosaurs. The next one will not care about us. But we can care, we can prepare, we can choose to be something other than victims of cosmic chance. That is the real lesson of Chicxulub. Not that extinction is possible, we always knew that, but that extinction is not inevitable. That intelligence, properly applied, can see threats coming and respond to them. That the universe is dangerous but not hopeless. The dinosaurs had no choice, we do. But the story of discovery was not finished with the crater. Finding the wound was only the beginning. Understanding how it killed required decades more work, more expeditions, more analysis of rocks and fossils and the chemistry of ancient seas. The drilling began in 2016. An international team of scientists assembled off the coast of Mexico, aboard a research vessel bristling with equipment designed to extract cores from deep beneath the sea floor. Their target was the Peak Ring, a circular ridge of rock inside the crater that had been formed in the minutes after impact, when the crust rebounded from the initial compression. No one had ever sampled this rock before. For weeks, the drill bit descended through the sediments that had buried Chicxulub, through layers of limestone deposited over millions of years, through the geological boundary that marked the extinction itself. Each meter brought them closer to material that had not been touched since the day the world ended. At 800 meters, they reached it. The rock that came up was shattered, fractured, transformed by forces beyond anything that exists on Earth today. Granite that should have been buried 20 kilometers below the surface had been thrown upward and outward, mixed with melted rock and impact glass and fragments of the asteroid itself. The violence frozen in that stone was almost incomprehensible, but the scientists could read it. They found that the crater had formed in less than 10 minutes. The initial impact, the collapse of the transient cavity, the rebound of the central peak, the flooding by the returning sea, all of it happened faster than a lunch break. 10 minutes to reshape the planet. 10 minutes to end an era. They found carbon and sulfur in quantities that confirmed the worst fears. The rocks beneath the Yucatan had released billions of tons of climate-altering gases when they vaporized. The sulfur alone would have blocked enough sunlight to drop global temperatures by more than 10 degrees. The carbon dioxide would have persisted for centuries, trapping heat once the dust settled, creating a greenhouse effect that followed the impact winter. The climate had been punched in both directions. First too cold, then too hot. The survivors of the initial catastrophe faced not one crisis, but two, a 1-2 punch that left ecosystems no time to adapt. The species that made it through had to survive freezing, then burning, then everything in between. The drilling revealed something else unexpected. Life had returned to the crater almost immediately. Within years of the impact, the boiling waters of the crater had cooled enough to support bacteria. Within thousands of years, fish were swimming where the asteroid had struck. The wound had become an oasis, a warm pool of nutrient-rich water that attracted survivors from the surrounding devastation. Life was resilient. More resilient than anyone had imagined. The same impact that had caused the greatest extinction in 65 million years had also created conditions for rapid recovery. The heat from the buried rocks kept the water warm. The shattered crust allowed nutrients to flow upward. The absence of competitors meant that anything that arrived could thrive. The crater told a story of death and rebirth written in a single location. Other expeditions found different pieces of the puzzle. In North Dakota, a site called Tannis preserved the first hours after impact with astonishing clarity. Paleontologist Robert De Palma spent years excavating a riverbed that had been buried by the debris wave from Chicxulub, 3,000 kilometers away from the impact itself. He found fish with impact spherules lodged in their gills. They had been breathing when the debris fell from the sky. They had inhaled the tiny glass beads formed when molten rock cooled in the upper atmosphere. They had died within an hour of the impact, buried by a surge of water and sediment that preserved them like insects in amber. He found dinosaur feathers. Not bones, but feathers, the delicate structures that rarely survive fossilization. They were scattered through the deposit, torn from bodies by the violence of the surge, preserved in the mud that had killed their owners. The dinosaurs had been alive that morning. By afternoon, they were fossils. He found a leg. A complete leg, torn from a dinosaur by the force of the debris wave, preserved in 3 dimensions with skin and tendons still attached. This animal had been walking when the sky fell. It had been alive when the shockwave reached North Dakota. It had died not from starvation or cold or any of the slow mechanisms that killed most dinosaurs, but from the direct violence of the impact itself, 3,000 kilometers away. Tannis was a snapshot of the worst day in history, frozen in stone, waiting 66 million years for someone to read it. The evidence kept accumulating. In the deep sea, scientists found layers of impact debris that told of global tsunamis and oceanic chaos. The waves had been so large, so powerful, that they had scoured the seafloor across entire ocean basins. They had torn up sediments that had lain undisturbed for millions of years, mixing them with the falling debris from the impact, creating a geological record of unimaginable violence. In the rocks of India, scientists found evidence that the Deccan volcanism had intensified immediately after the impact. The earthquakes generated by Chicxulub had travelled through the planet and triggered eruptions on the other side of the world. The dinosaurs had been hit from space and from below simultaneously, caught between an asteroid and a volcano, doomed by a coincidence of catastrophes. Some scientists argued that the volcanism deserved more blame. The debate continues, but most scientists now agree that the asteroid was the primary killer. The volcanism made things worse, but it was the rock from space that pushed the system over the edge. They were caught in a perfect storm of destruction. The investigation expanded beyond Earth. Astronomers traced the asteroid's origin to a family of objects formed when a larger asteroid was shattered by a collision in the asteroid belt about 160 million years ago. One fragment of that shattered world had wandered for nearly 100 million years before finding its way to Earth. The dinosaurs had been killed by a piece of a world that had died before they evolved. Space telescopes now track thousands of near-Earth objects, mapping their orbits, identifying the ones that might threaten us someday. We have found most of the planet killers. None of them are on collision courses with Earth. For now, we are working on it. The dinosaurs died because they could not see the sky as anything but safe. We know better. We know that the sky is full of rocks, that space is not empty, that the solar system is a shooting gallery and Earth is a target. We know because we dug up the evidence, pieced together the story, understood what happened 66 million years ago, well enough to recognize the threat it represents to our own future. Knowledge is power. The dinosaurs had neither. We have both. The crater at Chicxulub is a monument. A monument to what was lost, a monument to what was gained, a monument to the fragility of life and the violence of the cosmos and the strange, improbable chain of events that led from an explosion in the Yucatan to a species capable of understanding that explosion. We are the children of that catastrophe. Every one of us carries the legacy of the survivors in our DNA, the mammals that hid in burrows, the birds that found food in the darkness, the fish that weathered the acid seas. They are our ancestors. We exist because they existed. We think and dream and wonder because they ate and hid and survived. The asteroid made us possible. That is the strangest part of this story. The same event that destroyed the most successful animals in Earth's history created the conditions for our own existence. If the asteroid had missed, if it had arrived a few hours earlier or later, if it had struck a different location or at a different angle, we would not be here. The dinosaurs might still rule. Mammals might still be rat-sized creatures hiding in the shadows. Intelligence might never have evolved. The planet might be home to creatures we cannot imagine, descendants of dinosaurs that continued to evolve for another 66 million years. But that is not what happened. What happened was extinction. What happened was opportunity. What happened was us. And now we stand on the shoulders of the dead, looking back at the day that made us possible, understanding for the first time in the history of life what it means to be vulnerable to the stars. The story of Chicxulub is not over. It continues in every telescope pointed at the sky, in every mission to study asteroids, in every scientist working to understand the threats we face. The dinosaurs could not choose their fate. We can choose ours. That is their gift to us. That is the meaning of their extinction. Not just death, but possibility. Not just ending, but beginning. The beginning of everything that would eventually become us. The dinosaurs are not gone. This is the part of the story that most people miss. They think extinction means disappearance, means ending, means nothing left behind but bones in museums and images in movies. But extinction is more complicated than that. The dinosaurs did not vanish. They transformed. Look out your window. If you see a bird, any bird, you are seeing a dinosaur. Not a descendant of dinosaurs, not a relative of dinosaurs, a dinosaur. The sparrow on your fence is as much a dinosaur as Tyrannosaurus rex ever was. The crow on the telephone wire carries 66 million years of survival in its hollow bones. The chicken in your backyard is a living fossil, a breathing reminder that the age of dinosaurs never really ended. It just changed. The birds that survived the impact were already dinosaurs. They belonged to a group called the theropods, the same group that included Velociraptor and Tyrannosaurus and all the famous predatory dinosaurs you can name. Somewhere in the Jurassic, one branch of this family had developed feathers, had shrunk, had learned to fly. By the time the asteroid arrived, they had been soaring through Cretaceous skies for tens of millions of years. They were dinosaurs that had found a different way to live. When the darkness fell, when the forests burned, when their larger cousins starved and froze, the birds found ways to survive. They could fly to find food, they could shelter in places too small for giants. They could eat seeds that lasted through the winter, could hunt insects in the darkness, could do all the things that their ground-dwelling relatives could not. They made it through. And when the sun finally returned, when the skies cleared and the world began to heal, they were still there, changed perhaps, reduced in diversity certainly, but alive, still dinosaurs, still carrying the genetic legacy of creatures that had walked the earth since before the first flower bloomed. 10,000 species of birds exist today. 10,000 different ways of being a dinosaur in a world that thinks dinosaurs are extinct. They range from hummingbirds that weigh less than a penny to ostriches that stand taller than a man. They live on every continent, in every climate, from the frozen Antarctic to the burning Sahara. They have conquered the air more completely than the pterosaurs ever did. They are the great success story of the extinction. Not the mammals, who emerged from the shadows to fill the niches left empty by the giants. Not the reptiles, who survived by hiding and waiting and changing as little as possible. The birds, the dinosaurs that flew, the ones who looked down from the sky as their world ended and somehow, impossibly, found a way to keep going. When you hear birdsong in the morning, you are hearing the voice of the Mesozoic. Those calls evolved in a world we can barely imagine, in forests filled with giants, under skies shared with pterosaurs. They were perfected over millions of years, shaped by sexual selection and territorial competition and the need to communicate across distances that would swallow any other sound. The robins singing outside your window is performing a concert that began before the asteroid fell. The connection goes deeper than sound. Look at a bird's foot. You will see scales, the same scales that covered the legs of dinosaurs. Look at a bird's wishbone. You will see a structure called the furcula, present in theropod dinosaurs for 100 million years before the first bird took flight. Look at a bird's breathing system, its hollow bones, its rapid metabolism. All of these features were inherited from dinosaur ancestors. The birds did not replace the dinosaurs. They are the dinosaurs. This changes how we should think about the extinction. The event that we call the death of the dinosaurs was really a transformation, a pruning, a violent reshaping of a family tree that continued to grow even as most of its branches were cut away. The dinosaurs didn't fail. One lineage of them succeeded so spectacularly that it survived the worst day in Earth's history and went on to dominate the skies. But there is a sadness in this success. The birds that survived were not the most magnificent dinosaurs. They were not the largest, the most powerful, the most terrifying. The Tyrannosaurus line ended. The Triceratops line ended. The giant sauropods, those long-necked titans that shook the ground with every step, they ended too. What survived was small and light and able to hide. The meek inherited the earth. Not because they deserved it, not because they were better adapted in any absolute sense, simply because they happened to have the traits that allowed survival through a catastrophe that no one could have predicted. The dinosaurs that ruled were exactly the ones that could not survive. Their size, their power, their dominance all became liabilities when the world changed overnight. There is a lesson in this. Success is not permanent. Power is not protection. The traits that make you dominant in one world can destroy you in another. The Tyrannosaurus was perfectly adapted to the Cretaceous. It was magnificently, overwhelmingly, terrifyingly good at being what it was. And that perfection killed it. When the rules changed, it could not change with them. The birds were not perfect. They were compromises, adaptations, experiments that had not yet reached their full potential. They were still evolving, still changing, still figuring out what they could become, and that flexibility, that incompleteness saved them. They could adapt because they had not yet finished adapting. They could survive because they were still learning how to live. Evolution does not have a destination. It does not march toward perfection or progress or any final form. It simply responds to conditions, producing whatever works in the moment, discarding whatever does not. The dinosaurs that seemed most successful were actually the most trapped, locked into ways of life that could not bend when bending was required. The survivors were the flexible ones, the generalists, the small, the ones who had not yet committed to a single strategy. They inherited a world that was nothing like the one they had evolved for, and they thrived anyway. They filled the empty niches. They diversified into forms that their ancestors could not have imagined. They became what they are today. The fossil record teaches humility. 99% of all species that have ever existed are extinct, not because they were failures, but because conditions changed in ways they could not anticipate. The trilobites dominated the oceans for 300 million years before disappearing completely. The ammonites survived multiple mass extinctions before finally succumbing to Chicxulub. Success is temporary. Extinction is normal. We are not immune. Humans like to think of ourselves as the culmination of evolution, the final product, the species that figured it all out. But we are just another experiment, another branch on a tree that has been growing for 4 billion years. Our intelligence, our technology, our civilization, none of these guarantee survival. They only give us options that other species lacked. The dinosaurs had no options. When the sky fell, they could only wait and die. They could not see the asteroid coming, could not understand what was happening, could not do anything to change their fate. They were victims of a universe that does not care about the creatures it creates. We are different. We can look up at the sky and see the threats. We can calculate the orbits of asteroids, can track the objects that might destroy us, can even imagine ways to deflect them. We have telescopes and rockets and mathematics. We have the ability to see the future in ways that no other species has ever possessed. But ability is not destiny. We also have the capacity to ignore threats, to deny dangers, to focus on immediate concerns while existential risks accumulate unaddressed. We are the first species that could prevent its own extinction, but we are also a species that might choose not to. The dinosaurs had no choice. We have choice, and choice is a burden as well as a gift. The crater at Chicxulub reminds us what is at stake. 180 kilometers of scar tissue buried beneath a thin layer of time, marking the spot where one world ended and another began. It is a monument to randomness, to the terrifying contingency of existence, to the fact that everything we know and love and depends on events that no one planned and no one controlled. If the asteroid had missed, we would not exist. This is the strangest truth of all. Our existence is not inevitable. It is not the result of progress or destiny or any cosmic plan. It is the result of a rock hitting a planet at exactly the right moment to kill exactly the right creatures, to open exactly the right opportunities for exactly the right survivors. We are children of catastrophe. Every cell in your body carries the legacy of that day. The mammals that hid in burrows while the world burned, they are your ancestors. The birds that flew through the darkened skies, they are your distant cousins. The fish that weathered the acid seas, the insects that ate the dead, the bacteria that broke down the bodies of giants, all of them contributed to the chain of events that led to you. You are made of survivors. Generations beyond counting, each one facing challenges that would have destroyed lesser creatures, each one finding a way through. Your existence is proof that life is resilient, that it can endure catastrophes that seem insurmountable, that it always finds a way even when there seems to be no way. But survival is not guaranteed. The same record that shows life's resilience also shows its fragility. The same fossils that prove survival also prove extinction. Life goes on, but specific forms of life end. The dinosaurs were magnificently, exuberantly alive, and they ended anyway. Their bones lie in the rock, testament to the fact that being alive is not enough to stay alive. The universe does not owe us continuation. It gave us existence, gave us consciousness, gave us the ability to wonder at our own improbability, but it did not promise us forever. It did not guarantee that we would last. It simply set us on a stage where survival is possible but not certain, where the same forces that created us could destroy us without warning or remorse. This is not a reason for despair. It is a reason for wonder, a reason for gratitude, a reason to look at the world with eyes that understand how unlikely it is that we are here to see it. Every sunrise is a gift that the dinosaurs did not receive on their last morning. Every breath is a miracle of chemistry and biology that has been refined by 4 billion years of evolution. We are the universe looking back at itself. We are matter that has learned to think, to wonder, to ask questions about its own origins. We are the dinosaurs' revenge in a way, the creatures that emerged from the destruction to understand what was destroyed. We dig up their bones and give them names and try to imagine what it was like to be them, to walk in their world, to breathe their air, to die their deaths. They cannot know us. They were gone 66 million years before we arrived, but we can know them. We can reconstruct their lives from the fragments they left behind. We can understand their world, their biology, their extinction in ways they could never have understood themselves. We are their witnesses, the only witnesses they will ever have. That is a kind of immortality. The dinosaurs live on not just in the birds, their physical descendants, but in us, their intellectual inheritors. We carry them in our imaginations, in our museums, in our stories and our science. We have brought them back from the dead in the only way that matters, by remembering them, by understanding them, by refusing to let them fade into the void of forgotten time. The extinction that killed them gave us life. The catastrophe that ended their world began ours. The rock that fell from the sky 66 million years ago is the reason you can read these words, the reason there are words to read, the reason there are minds to read them. Everything connects. The asteroid and the crater and the darkness and the cold, the survivors and the mammals and the primates and the humans, the fossils and the scientists and the discoveries and the knowledge, all of it linked by chains of cause and effect, stretching back to a morning when the sky fell and the world changed forever. We are part of that chain. The newest link, perhaps, but not the last. Other links will follow. Other species will inherit what we leave behind, just as we inherited what the dinosaurs left. The story does not end with us any more than it ended with them. It simply continues. Transformed, adapted, changed beyond recognition, but continuous. Life finding new ways to live. The universe continuing to explore its own possibilities, the chain of existence stretching forward into a future we cannot imagine, just as the dinosaurs could not imagine us. They gave us everything by giving us nothing. By dying, they made room. By ending, they enabled beginning. By losing their world, they gave us ours. That is their legacy. That is what the last day of the dinosaurs means. Not just death, not just extinction, not just the end of an era, the beginning of everything that came after, including us, including now, including whatever comes next. But before we reach the end of this story, there is more to understand about what the dinosaurs left behind, more to grasp about the ways their extinction shaped not just biology, but the very nature of the world we inhabit. The Earth itself was transformed, not just temporarily, not just during the impact winter and the recovery that followed, but permanently. The ecosystems that emerged from the catastrophe were fundamentally different from those that existed before. The rules of life had been rewritten in fire and darkness, and the new rules favoured different players. Consider the forests. Before the extinction, conifers dominated. Pine trees and their relatives had ruled the land for over 100 million years, their evergreen needles adapted to a world where dinosaurs browsed on their branches. The flowering plants were newcomers, still expanding, still finding their place in a world already occupied. After the extinction, everything reversed. The flowering plants exploded. Freed from competition with the established ecosystems, they diversified into the forms that dominate today. Grasses evolved and spread across continents. Fruit-bearing trees appeared and multiplied. The forests of the modern world, the jungles and woodlands and orchards, all trace their ancestry to the recovery that followed Chicxulub. The dinosaurs had been holding back a revolution. Their browsing had shaped what could grow, had limited what could succeed, had kept the flowering plants in check. When they died, the plants they had suppressed were unleashed. The world literally bloomed in their absence, producing the riot of flowers and fruits and seeds that we take for granted today. Consider the oceans. The marine reptiles that had ruled the seas were gone. The mosasaurs, the plesiosaurs, the entire guild of large marine predators wiped out in a geological instant. Their extinction opened niches that would eventually be filled by creatures that did not yet exist. Whales evolved to fill those empty waters. Descendants of small land mammals that returned to the sea tens of millions of years after the extinction, they grew to sizes that rivaled and eventually exceeded anything the Mesozoic had produced. The blue whale, the largest animal ever to exist, larger than any dinosaur, larger than any marine reptile, exists because the ocean was emptied of competitors by an asteroid. The shape of the modern ocean was determined by a rock from space. Consider the mammals themselves. Before the extinction, they had been constrained, limited to small sizes, restricted to nocturnal habits, confined to ecological margins by dinosaurs that occupied every other niche. They had potential, enormous potential, but that potential could not be realized in a world already full. The asteroid gave them room. Within 10 million years of the impact, mammals had grown larger than any mammal had ever been. Within 20 million years, they had diversified into the basic forms that exist today: horses and whales and elephants and primates and cats and dogs and all the familiar shapes of the mammalian world, all of them products of the opportunity created by extinction. We are shaped by absence as much as presence. The things that are not here, the dinosaurs that did not survive, they determined what could flourish in their place. Every mammal alive today exists in a space that was cleared by catastrophe. Every bird alive today descends from survivors who inherited skies emptied of pterosaurs. The world is haunted by ghosts, by the shapes of creatures that once filled it, by the niches they left vacant when they died. This is the deepest lesson of the extinction. Death creates life. Ending enables beginning. The universe is not wasteful. It recycles everything, including the opportunities created by loss. The dinosaurs are not truly gone because nothing is truly gone. Their atoms dispersed into the air and soil and water and were taken up by new life. The carbon that once formed dinosaur bones now forms our bones. We are literally made of dinosaurs, recycled through 66 million years of ecological cycles. The fossil record teaches this lesson over and over. The bones we dig up are not truly dead. They are transformed, mineralized, turned to stone, but still present, still here, still carrying information about creatures that walked and breathed and lived. The dinosaurs wrote their autobiography in rock, and we have learned to read it. What stories they tell. Stories of growth and change, recorded in the rings of dinosaur bones like the rings of ancient trees. Stories of injury and healing, visible in fossils that show broken bones mended by time. Stories of predation and struggle, written in tooth marks on bone and the scattered remains of ancient meals. Stories of reproduction and care, preserved in nests and eggs and the tiny bones of babies that never hatched. These stories connect us to creatures we can never meet. When we look at a fossil, we are looking at an individual that once existed in a specific place at a specific time, not an abstraction, a life. The dinosaurs were individuals, each one unique, each one experiencing its own existence, each one navigating a world that was as vivid and real to it as ours is to us. They felt hunger and satisfaction, fear and comfort, the warmth of sun and the chill of rain. They had lives in the fullest sense of the word, and those lives ended. not peacefully, not naturally, not in the way that most lives end. They ended in fire and darkness and cold and starvation. They ended badly, tragically, unfairly. The dinosaurs did nothing to deserve their extinction. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, victims of cosmic chance. There is grief in this recognition. Grief for creatures that cannot be saved, that were lost before we could know them. We are their witnesses now. 66 million years too late to help, but not too late to remember. Perhaps memory is the only immortality there is. The dinosaurs live because we choose to let them live. Because we dig up their bones and reconstruct their forms and give them names and imagine their world. Because we refuse to let them fade into the anonymous void of deep time. We gain something from this remembering. We gain perspective on our own existence. We gain humility in the face of cosmic forces we cannot control. We gain wonder at the improbability of our own emergence from the catastrophe that killed them. The dinosaurs are our teachers. They teach us that dominance is not permanent, that success can become vulnerability, that the universe is indifferent to our hopes and fears, that life is precious precisely because it is fragile, that everything we love can be taken away by forces beyond our comprehension. These are hard lessons, but they are true lessons. The dinosaurs died because they could not see the truth about their situation. We have the ability to see. The crater at Chicxulub waits beneath the water. Hidden, healed, but still there. A scar that will last for hundreds of millions of years. Future intelligent species, if they arise, will find it. They will wonder what happened. They will learn the same lessons, that life is contingent, that survival is not guaranteed, that the universe creates and destroys without preference or plan. The dinosaurs could not create meaning. Their brains, remarkable as they were, did not produce the kind of consciousness that wonders about its own existence. They lived fully in the present, in the immediate reality of hunger and fear and reproduction. They had no past in the way we have a past, no future in the way we have a future. We have both. We can look back 66 million years and understand what happened. We can look forward to threats that might come and plan to meet them. We exist in time in ways that the dinosaurs never did, aware of our own mortality, capable of imagining our own extinction. This awareness is our burden and our gift. It allows us to prepare for dangers that other species cannot see coming. It allows us to grieve for losses that other species cannot remember. The dinosaurs had their time. 165 million years of dominance, of triumph, of magnificent success, and then, in a single day, it ended. Their time became our time. Their world became our world. Their story became the prologue to our story. We owe them a debt we can never repay, except by remembering, except by learning, except by taking seriously the lessons their extinction teaches. Their death created the conditions for our life. Their ending enabled our beginning. That is not justice. It is just the way things happened. Chance, not design. Accident, not purpose. But we can give it meaning. We can decide that their extinction matters, that their lives mattered, that the 66 million years separating us does not diminish our connection to them. We can choose to be their inheritors in spirit, as well as biology. We can choose to remember, and in remembering, we keep them alive, in story, in wonder, in the endless human need to understand where we came from. The dinosaurs are part of that story. Their beginning led to their ending led to our beginning, and our beginning is part of the same chain of life and death and transformation, the same ancient dance of existence, still dancing, still going, still alive. Somewhere right now a child is holding a plastic dinosaur. Small fingers wrapped around a tiny Tyrannosaurus, imagination filling in what the toy cannot provide, the roar, the thunder of footsteps, the world that existed before there were humans to wonder about it. That child does not know the science, does not understand the millions of years, or the asteroid, or the mechanisms of extinction, but the child feels something true. The dinosaurs matter. They matter in ways that transcend facts and figures and geological timelines. They reach into something deep in the human spirit, something that hungers for worlds beyond our own, for creatures larger than life, for proof that reality can exceed imagination. Every generation discovers them again. Every child who sees a dinosaur skeleton for the first time experiences the same shock of recognition, the same impossible thrill of realizing that these things were real, not stories, not myths, not fantasies invented by artists and dreamers, real animals that walked real ground under a real sun, breathing the same air, drinking the same water, living on the same planet that we call home. That connection matters. It reminds us that the world is older than we are, that it belonged to others before it belonged to us, that we are not the first tenants in this house, and we will not be the last. The dinosaurs were here for so long that our entire human story is barely a footnote to theirs. They owned this planet when the continents were in different places, when the stars were in different positions, when nothing that exists today had yet come into being, and then they were gone. Not because they failed, not because they were inferior, not because evolution had something better in mind. They were gone because a rock fell from the sky at the wrong moment, in the wrong place, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. That is the truth that the dinosaurs teach us. The universe is not safe. It is not designed for our comfort or our survival. It is vast and ancient and filled with forces that do not care whether we exist or not. We live on a small planet orbiting an ordinary star in an unremarkable corner of a galaxy that contains billions of other stars, most of them with planets of their own, most of those planets empty and lifeless and cold. We are rare. Life is rare. Consciousness is rarer still. The ability to look back through 66 million years and understand what happened, to feel grief for creatures we never met, to wonder about our own place in the cosmic story. This is something precious beyond measure. The dinosaurs could not do this. They lived fully in the present, in the immediate reality of hunger and fear and reproduction. They did not wonder where they came from or where they were going. They did not create art or tell stories or build monuments to their dead. They simply existed magnificently for 165 million years, and then they stopped existing. We are different. We carry the past inside us. We imagine the future before it arrives. We create meaning where there is no inherent meaning, impose pattern on chaos, find purpose in a universe that offers none. This is our gift and our burden, the thing that makes us human, the thing that separates us from every other creature that has ever lived. We can choose what the dinosaurs' extinction means. We can see it as tragedy, as waste, as proof that existence is cruel and random and ultimately pointless. We can look at those magnificent creatures reduced to bones in rock and feel only despair at the indifference of the cosmos, or we can see it as something else. We can see it as the event that made us possible, as the clearing of a stage that allowed new actors to perform, as the violent, terrible, necessary transformation that opened the door to everything we are and everything we might become. The same event. Two meanings. The choice is ours. This is what separates us from the dinosaurs more than intelligence or language or technology. We can choose our relationship to the past. We can decide what lessons to draw, what stories to tell, what significance to assign to events that happened before we existed. The dinosaurs left us their bones. scattered across every continent, buried in rock that was once mud, preserved by processes that take millions of years. They left us the evidence of their lives, the clues that allowed us to reconstruct their world, the fragments from which we have assembled this story. They did not know they were leaving anything. They did not know there would be anyone to find what they left. They simply lived and died, and the earth kept their remains, and time turned those remains to stone, and we came along and dug them up and wondered. The wondering is ours. The dinosaurs cannot wonder about us. They cannot know that their deaths led to our births. They cannot appreciate the strange, looping irony of creatures who exist only because they went extinct, spending their lives studying their extinction. That awareness belongs to us alone, and with awareness comes responsibility. We know things now that no species has ever known. We know about asteroids, we know about mass extinctions, we know about the fragility of life and the violence of the cosmos. We know that what happened to the dinosaurs could happen to us, and we know, at least in theory, how to prevent it. Knowledge without action is just information. The dinosaurs did not have information about the threat they faced. We do. We have telescopes scanning the skies, we have scientists calculating orbits, we have engineers designing spacecraft that could, if necessary, deflect an incoming object. We have everything the dinosaurs lacked, except certainty. We cannot be certain that we will use what we know. We cannot be certain that we will invest the resources, make the preparations, take seriously a threat that seems remote and abstract compared to the immediate concerns of daily life. We have the tools. Whether we have the will is another question. The dinosaurs ask us that question from across 66 million years. Their silence is a challenge, their absence is a warning, their extinction is a message written in the language of geology, readable by anyone willing to look at the evidence and understand what it means. What does it mean to you? That question has no single answer. Each person who hears this story will take something different from it. Some will feel wonder at the grandeur of deep time, at the vast sweep of history that preceded our arrival. Some will feel grief for the creatures lost, for the worlds that ended, for the suffering that must have accompanied those final days. Some will feel fear. The knowledge that extinction is possible, that it has happened before, that it could happen again, this knowledge sits heavy on the human heart. We do not like to think about endings. We prefer to imagine that our story will continue forever, that our species will persist, that the future stretches out infinite and assured before us. The dinosaurs remind us that nothing is assured. But fear is not the only response to uncertainty. Wonder is possible too. Gratitude, determination, the recognition that every moment is precious precisely because moments end, that life is valuable precisely because it is fragile, that existence is miraculous precisely because it is not guaranteed. The dinosaurs had 165 million years. We have had 300,000, a fraction of their time, a blink in geological terms, and yet in that blink we have done things they never dreamed of. We have left the planet, we have split the atom, we have decoded the instructions that build living things. We have looked back through time and understood what ended their reign. What will we do with the time we have left? That question hangs over this entire story, not because it has an answer, but because asking it matters. The dinosaurs could not ask what they would do with their future. We can, we must. The asking is part of what makes us human. The morning the asteroid fell was a morning like any other. The sun rose over a world that had no idea it was ending. Creatures woke and ate and fought and mated and cared for their young, doing all the things that living creatures do, unaware that this day was different from all the days that had come before. We wake each morning to similar uncertainty. not about asteroids necessarily, but about the 1,000 other ways that existence can change without warning. We cannot know what the day will bring. We cannot predict the events that will transform our lives, our societies, our species. We can only live as the dinosaurs lived in the present moment, doing our best with what we have. But we can also remember. We can carry with us the knowledge of what happened to those who came before. We can let their story inform our choices, shape our priorities, remind us of what matters. We can be the creatures who learned from the past, who took seriously the lessons it offered, who refused to repeat the mistakes that were not really mistakes at all, just the random cruelty of a universe that does not play favourites. The crater at Chicxulub is healing. 66 million years of sediment have buried it, hidden it, transformed it from a wound into a scar, into a memory preserved in rock. The Earth has moved on. Life has moved on. The planet that was nearly sterilized now teems with more species than ever before. More diversity, more complexity, more ways of being alive. That is the final lesson. Life does not give up. It does not surrender to catastrophe. It finds a way through, around, beyond. It adapts and transforms and begins again, no matter how complete the destruction, no matter how total the loss. The same planet that saw the dinosaurs die has seen new wonders rise from their ashes. We are one of those wonders. Improbable, imperfect, still evolving. We are the universe's way of knowing itself, of looking back and understanding, of feeling grief and wonder and hope. We are what happens when matter becomes complex enough to ask questions about its own existence. The dinosaurs could not ask those questions. But we can ask them on their behalf. We can wonder what they experienced, how they lived, what it was like to be them. We can extend our empathy across 66 million years to creatures who could never reciprocate it. We can care about beings who cannot know they are cared about. That caring is not weakness. It is the highest expression of what we are, the ability to extend concern beyond ourselves, beyond our species, beyond our time. This is what makes us worth saving. If we are to justify our existence, if we are to earn the opportunity that the dinosaurs' extinction gave us, we must become worthy of it. We must care about things that cannot care back. We must protect what is vulnerable. We must remember what is forgotten. We must speak for those who have no voice. The dinosaurs are gone, but their message persists. It echoes through the halls of museums, through the pages of books, through the minds of everyone who has ever looked at a fossil and felt something stir. Listen to that message. It says that time is precious, that life is fleeting, that the worlds we take for granted can end without warning. It says that we are connected to everything that came before, that we carry the legacy of billions of years of evolution, that we are not separate from nature but part of it, shaped by it, dependent on it. The dinosaurs were part of nature too. They thought, if they thought at all, that their world would last forever. They had no concept of extinction, no understanding of endings, no ability to imagine a world without themselves. They were innocent in ways that we can never be again. We have eaten from the tree of knowledge. We know about endings now. We know about extinction. We know that the universe is not arranged for our benefit, that survival requires effort, that the future is not guaranteed. This knowledge has cost us the innocence that the dinosaurs possessed, but it has given us something in return. It has given us agency, the ability to see threats and respond to them, the capacity to choose our fate rather than simply accepting whatever the cosmos throws at us. We are the first species in the history of Earth that could potentially prevent its own extinction. That is not nothing. That is everything. The last day of the dinosaurs was the first day of our possibility. From their ending came our beginning. From their death came our life. From the worst disaster this planet had seen in 65 million years came the opportunity for everything we have become and everything we might yet be. We owe them more than memory. We owe them the full use of the gifts their extinction gave us. We owe them a future worthy of the sacrifice they never knew they made. We owe them proof that their deaths meant something, that the catastrophe that ended their world was not just destruction but transformation. The sun will rise tomorrow. It will rise on a world still filled with dinosaurs, though we call them birds now. It will rise on mammals who inherited a planet cleared for them by cosmic violence. It will rise on humans who can look back through time and understand the story of how they came to be. And somewhere a child will pick up a plastic dinosaur. We'll roar and stomp and imagine worlds that vanished before imagination existed. We'll feel, without understanding, the connection that binds us to everything that lived before. We'll carry forward the wonder that makes us human. The dinosaurs are not forgotten. They live in the birds outside your window. They live in the fossils beneath your feet. They live in the stories we tell and the questions we ask and the wonder we feel when we contemplate the vastness of time. They live in you. In the atoms of your body that once were theirs, in the world that their absence created, in the curiosity that drives you to learn about things that happened before you were born. 66 million years ago, the world ended, and from that ending, eventually, impossibly, wonderfully, came everything you know, including this moment, including you, including whatever comes next. The story is not over. It is only beginning again, as it always does, as it always will, until the last star burns out and the universe falls silent. But that silence is far away, and right now, right here, on this small blue planet circling an ordinary star, life continues. The dinosaurs would be amazed to see what their world became. We should be amazed too, every single day, because we are here, against all odds, children of catastrophe, inheritors of extinction, alive. Think about what that word means, alive. It means atoms arranged in patterns so complex that they can contemplate their own arrangement. It means chemistry that has learned to reproduce itself, to adapt, to evolve, to wonder. It means a fire that has been burning unbroken for 4 billion years, passed from organism to organism, generation to generation, extinction to recovery to extinction again. You are part of that fire. The same flame that warmed the first cells in the ancient oceans warms you now. The same drive that pushed life onto land, into the air, through the worst catastrophes the planet could produce, that drive beats in your heart this very moment. You are not separate from the story of life on Earth. You are its latest chapter. The dinosaurs were a chapter too. A long one, longer than any that came before or since. They filled the world with forms so strange and magnificent that we are still discovering them, still marvelling at them, still struggling to believe that such creatures actually existed. They were not failures, they were triumphs. Evolutionary masterpieces that dominated every ecosystem on the planet, and then a rock fell from the sky. One rock, one day, one moment of cosmic coincidence that erased 165 million years of success. The dinosaurs did not see it coming, could not have seen it coming. They were evolved for a world where the sky was safe, where the greatest dangers came from predators and disease and competition, where the rules of survival were written in tooth and claw. The asteroid broke all the rules. It introduced a variable that evolution had not prepared anyone for. It proved that the game could end at any moment, that all the adaptations and strategies and victories meant nothing when the universe decided to throw a mountain at your planet. We know this now. We know that the solar system is a shooting gallery. We know that impacts have happened before and will happen again. We know that the question is not whether another large object will strike the Earth, but when. This knowledge separates us from every species that came before, but knowledge alone is not enough. The dinosaurs would have benefited nothing from knowing an asteroid was coming if they could not have done anything about it. Knowledge without power is just awareness of doom. What matters is whether we will use our knowledge to act, to prepare, to build the systems that could save us if the sky falls again. We have made a start. Telescopes scan the heavens every night, cataloguing objects that cross Earth's orbit. Most of the planet killers have been found. None of them are aimed at us. For now, missions have been launched to practice deflecting asteroids. The technology works. We demonstrated it. We pushed a small asteroid into a different orbit just to prove we could. For the first time in the history of life, a species on this planet has the ability to prevent an impact extinction. Whether we will use that ability depends on us, on whether we take the threat seriously, on whether we invest the resources, on whether we maintain the vigilance that survival requires. The dinosaurs had no choice in their fate. We have a choice, and that choice will determine whether our story continues or ends. The decision is not abstract. It will be made by real people facing real pressures to spend money on immediate concerns rather than threats that might not materialize for centuries. It will be made by us, by our children, by the generations that follow. The dinosaurs could not pass anything to their descendants. When they died completely. Their knowledge, such as it was, died with them. Their experiences, their adaptations, their millions of years of accumulated survival, all of it was lost. Each surviving species had to start over, learning from scratch the lessons that the dinosaurs had learned and forgotten. We are different. We can pass knowledge forward. We can write books and build institutions that persist beyond individual lifetimes. We can tell our children about the dinosaurs, about Chicxulub, about what it means that we are here and they are not. This is our superpower. Not intelligence alone, but accumulated intelligence. Not survival alone, but conscious survival that learns from the past and plans for the future. We are the species that remembers. The crater at Chicxulub is a reminder carved into the earth itself. It says that the universe is dangerous. It says that survival is not guaranteed. It says that even the mightiest can fall. Listen to that warning. The dinosaurs would tell you if they could. They would tell you to watch the skies. They would tell you not to repeat their fate. But they cannot tell you anything. They are gone. Only their bones remain. And we must speak for ourselves. For our children and their children and all the generations that might follow. The future is not guaranteed, but it is possible. The dinosaurs did not choose their extinction. It happened to them, an accident of cosmic timing. But we are not dinosaurs. We are creatures who can see the future, who can take actions today that affect tomorrow. That is what this story has been about. Not just the death of the dinosaurs, but the birth of possibility. Not just what happened 66 million years ago, but what it means for us now, in this moment. The sun will rise tomorrow. The birds will sing. The world will continue its ancient dance of life and death, predator and prey, birth and extinction. And somewhere, a scientist will point a telescope at the sky, searching for rocks that might threaten everything we love. That scientist is working for you. For your children, for the future. Be grateful for them. Be grateful for the knowledge they pursue, the vigilance they maintain. The dinosaurs had none of this. They had only the morning sun and the blue sky and the world they thought would last forever. And it was not enough. We have more. We have science and technology and the ability to coordinate across the entire planet. We have options. Use them. That is the final message of the dinosaurs. Use what you have. Act while you can. The time to prepare is before the crisis, not during it. The time to act is now. Listen to their silence. It speaks louder than words ever could. 66 million years of silence, saying one thing over and over to anyone willing to hear. Be ready, be vigilant, be alive. Because being alive is a miracle, and miracles should be protected. That is the story of the last day of the dinosaurs. That is what it means. That is why it matters. And that